There's this moment in the season 10 episode Tist. It aired May 3rd, 2006, for anyone keeping track, where Leanne Cartman is sitting on her couch, alone, in a quiet house. And for once in 20-something seasons of South Park, the joke isn't on her, because Cesar Millan, the dog whisperer, has just told her that she's a client, not a friend, and the camera holds on her face, and you can see it. That specific kind of loneliness that doesn't scream or cry. It just sits there, quietly, in a woman who has spent her entire adult life making sure everyone else, especially her son, is comfortable. And in that silence, Leanne does the thing she's always done. She turns to Eric, promises him whatever he wants, buys her companionship back with a Mega Ranger, and the slow, creeping return of everything Cesar Millan just fixed. And honestly, that single scene might tell you more about parenting, real parenting, the messy, psychological, nobody gets it right kind, than 100 self-help books ever could. Tonight, we're doing something a little different. We're not ranking episodes. We're not going through every dark moment or every prediction South Park got right. Tonight, we're putting the parents of South Park on the couch. All of them. Randy and Sharon Marsh. Gerald and Sheila Broflovski. Leanne Cartman. Stephen and Linda Stoch. Stuart and Carol McCormick. We're going to look at what a psychologist would actually say about how these people raise their kids, what patterns they repeat, what damage they do without even knowing it, and why Matt Stone and Trey Parker, whether they meant to or not, created one of the most psychologically accurate portraits of American family dysfunction that's ever been put on television. So if you're listening to this late at night, get comfortable. This one's going to take a while. And if you haven't subscribed yet, it really does help us keep making these deep dives for you. We put a lot of time into these. All right, let's get into it. I want to start where most people wouldn't. And that's with a question, not about a specific parent, about all of them. Because here's what strikes me every single time I rewatch South Park from the beginning. And I've been doing that a lot recently, putting this together. Every single one of these parents loves their children. I need you to sit with that for a second. Even the worst ones, even the ones who've done genuinely horrifying things, they all love their kids. And that's what makes this show so much sharper than people give it credit for. Because the thing about real psychological damage, the kind that shapes who you become as an adult, it almost never comes from parents who don't care. It comes from parents who care in the wrong way. Parents who love you but can't see you. Parents who protect you from the wrong things while leaving you wide open to the right ones. Parents who are so wrapped up in their own unresolved trauma that they can't stop themselves from passing it on, even when some part of them knows they're doing it. And that's every parent in South Park. Every single one. Let me tell you something about the way psychologists think about parenting, because it's going to frame everything we talk about tonight. There's this framework. It's been around since the 1960s. A developmental psychologist named Diana Baumrind laid it out, that breaks parenting into 4 basic styles. You've got authoritative parenting, which is the gold standard. High warmth, high structure, clear boundaries, but the kid feels loved and heard. Then you've got authoritarian parenting. High structure, low warmth. Rules are rules. You don't ask why. You don't get to have feelings about it. Then there's permissive parenting. High warmth, no structure. The parent is your best friend. They do anything for you, but there are 0 boundaries and 0 consequences. And finally, there's neglectful parenting. Low warmth, low structure. The parent is checked out, physically present, emotionally gone. Now here's the thing. Every one of these styles is represented in South Park. And the way Trey Parker and Matt Stone distribute them across the families is so accurate, it's almost eerie, because they don't just show you the style, they show you the results. They show you what each style produces in a child over time. And they do it with construction paper cutout characters on a show where a kid dies every episode. I mean, think about that for a second. Think about the fact that one of the most honest explorations of parenting psychology on television comes from the same show that gave us a talking piece of Christmas poo. All right, let's start with the family that I think is the most psychologically complex in the entire show. And it's not the one most people would guess, Leanne Cartman. I know people want to jump straight to Randy. Randy's funnier. Randy's had more screen time in recent years. But if you want to understand what South Park is actually saying about parenting, what it's been saying since 1997, you have to start with Leanne, because Leanne Cartman is, without exaggeration, one of the most complete portraits of permissive parenting failure ever put on screen. And the reason it works so well is that she's also one of the most sympathetic characters on the entire show. Look, Leanne first appeared in the series premiere. Cartman gets an anal probe, August 13th, 1997. And from the very first scene she's in, you can see the dynamic. She's sweet. She's accommodating. She gives Cartman a chocolate chicken pot pie with icing on top. And when he's rude to her, she doesn't push back. She just absorbs it. And that right there is the seed of everything that follows for the next almost 30 years of this show. Here's what a psychologist would say about Leanne. And I think this is the thing most people miss when they talk about her. The question isn't, why doesn't she discipline Eric? The question is, what psychological need does not disciplining Eric serve? Because that's the real question. That's always the real question when you're looking at permissive parenting. Nobody is permissive by accident. It's not laziness. It's not stupidity. It's a strategy. It's a coping mechanism. And in Leanne's case, it's a coping mechanism for loneliness. The show makes this explicit in Tst. I keep coming back to this episode because it's the single most psychologically revealing 22 minutes in the entire series. When Cesar Millan's techniques actually work on Cartman, and they do work, he becomes this well-adjusted, studious kid almost overnight. The problem isn't that Leanne can't maintain the discipline. The problem is that with a well-behaved Eric, Leanne has no one. He doesn't need her anymore. He's independent, he's healthy, and she's alone. And this is where you have to understand what's really going on beneath the surface. Leanne is a single mother. She's the only single mother among the main family. She has no partner. The show has made it abundantly clear across multiple episodes that she has almost no real friends. She fills that void with promiscuity. That's been a running thread since the season 1 episode, Cartman's Mom is a Dirty Slut, which originally aired February 25th, 1998. And she fills it with her relationship with Eric. But that relationship isn't actually a parent-child relationship. It's a companionship. She treats him like a peer, like a friend, like someone she needs to keep happy so they won't leave her. And honestly, when you look at it through that lens, Leanne's parenting makes perfect tragic sense. She's not failing to set boundaries because she doesn't know better. She's failing to set boundaries because setting boundaries means risking the only consistent relationship she has. If she says no to Eric, really says no, and holds it, he might pull away. He might not need her. And then what does she have? I've rewatched the Tist ending probably 6 times putting this video together, and it hits different every time. That final shot of Cartman with that unsettling smile on his face as ominous music plays, that's not just funny. That's not just dark. That's the show telling you, in the clearest possible terms, that Leanne just chose her own emotional comfort over her son's psychological health. She had a chance to break the cycle. Cesar Millan handed it to her, and she traded it away for company. Now here's the thing about permissive parenting that most people don't understand, and that the show illustrates better than almost any psychology textbook I've ever read. Permissive parenting doesn't produce happy kids. It produces anxious kids. It produces kids who have never learned frustration tolerance, who have never experienced a firm boundary, and come out the other side, knowing the world didn't end. And in the absence of those experiences, permissive parenting produces kids who are terrified on some deep, primal level that the world is chaotic and unpredictable, and that nobody is actually in charge. And what does Eric Cartman spend every single episode of this show trying to do? Control everything. Control everyone around him. Manipulate, scheme, dominate. Demand that people respect his authority. Because when nobody sets limits for you, you have to set them yourself. And when you're a child trying to create structure in a world where no adult will do it for you, the structure you create is going to be twisted and self-serving. And yeah, sometimes genuinely monstrous. I actually have a theory about this that I've never heard anyone else bring up. I think the reason Cartman is so obsessed with authority, "Respect my authorita," became one of the most iconic catchphrases in TV history for a reason, is precisely because he's never experienced legitimate authority in his home. He's performing authority because he's never seen it modeled for him. It's like a kid who's never been hugged trying to learn physical affection from watching movies. The basic shape is there, but everything is exaggerated and wrong and kind of unsettling. And look, Trey Parker basically confirmed this in an interview with NPR years ago. He talked about how the core dynamic with Leanne was inspired by real parents he and Matt Stone had encountered, mostly in Los Angeles, he said, who were so desperate to be friends with their kids that they were essentially creating monsters. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that these people were making really evil kids by refusing to be parents instead of friends. That's almost exactly what he said. And that's Leanne Cartman in a nutshell. But here's where it gets really interesting from a psychological perspective. Because Leanne isn't just permissive. She's also, on some level, neglectful. And those two things can coexist. I know that sounds contradictory. How can someone who gives their kid everything they want also be neglecting them? But that's exactly the paradox of this kind of parenting. Leanne gives Eric everything he asks for: food, toys, attention on his terms, but she doesn't give him what he actually needs: structure, consistency, the experience of hearing no and learning that the person who said it still loves you. The show even addresses this directly in the episode Shots. That's season 23, episode 3, aired October 9th, 2019, where there's a school meeting about vaccinations, and Sheila Broflovski implies that Leanne doesn't love Cartman enough to vaccinate him. And Leanne snaps. She yells. And what she says is telling. She says none of them have had to hold Eric down and go through what she goes through, and you can hear it in her voice. This isn't a woman who doesn't care about her child. This is a woman who is absolutely exhausted by the daily reality of managing a kid she's never given the tools to manage himself. And if you're listening to this and thinking, okay, but it's a cartoon, the kid feeds his bully's parents to him in chili. Yeah, he does. Scott Tenorman Must Die, season 5, episode 4, July 11th, 2001. And that episode also, by the way, retroactively becomes even darker when you learn in 201, season 14, episode 6, April 21st, 2010, that Jack Tenorman was actually Cartman's biological father. But even within the heightened reality of South Park, the psychological through line holds. A child with no boundaries, no consequences, and a parent who serves as a companion rather than an authority figure. That child is going to develop a distorted sense of what they can and cannot do to other people. And in Cartman's case, that distortion has been cranked up to its absolute most extreme for comedic and satirical purposes. But the root is real. And that root is Leanne, sitting on her couch, promising Eric a mega ranger so she doesn't have to be alone. Okay, so here's where I want to shift, and I want to do it in a way that might surprise you. Because after talking about Leanne Cartman, the permissive parent, the enabler, the one everyone points to as the obvious worst mom in South Park, I want to talk about the parents who are, in many ways, far more psychologically damaging, and nobody talks about them enough: Steven and Linda Stoch. Look, I've watched a lot of South Park. I've gone through every season multiple times with a notebook for this video, and the Stoch household is the one that genuinely makes me uncomfortable. Not because of what Steven and Linda do to Butters in any single episode, although some of those individual moments are genuinely horrifying, but because of the pattern. Because what the Stoches represent, psychologically, is something far more common and far more insidious than Leanne's permissiveness. The Stoches represent authoritarian parenting pushed to its absolute most destructive extreme. And the damage they do to Butters is the kind of damage that doesn't make for dramatic TV moments. It's the slow, grinding, invisible kind of damage. The kind you carry your whole life without even knowing you're carrying it. Let me lay out what we actually know about Steven and Linda Stoch from the show. Steven is controlling. He's rigid. He grounds Butters for everything, and I mean everything. The kid gets grounded for being last on a list he had no control over. He gets grounded for having a shuriken stuck in his eye. He gets grounded for being kidnapped. He gets grounded because his parents decided to sell him to Paris Hilton, and then he escaped. In The Ungroundable, Steven literally blames Butters for misplacing food in the pantry and threatens him until he reorganizes it. And the show's genius is that Steven doesn't see any of this as abusive. There's a line, and this one sticks with me, in City Sushi, season 15, episode 6, aired May 25th, 2011, where Steven says, "Well, it can't be our parenting. We're awesome." And he means it. He genuinely means it. That right there is the hallmark of the authoritarian parent. The absolute certainty that control equals love, that discipline equals care, that if your child is struggling, the solution is always more structure, more punishment, more confinement, never self-reflection, never the thought that maybe, just maybe, the way you're raising this kid is the problem. And here's what makes the Stoch dynamic even more psychologically devastating. There's a detail in The Fractured But Whole, the video game, which came out in 2017, where you encounter a drunk Steven and he has flashbacks to his own childhood, to his mother. And in those flashbacks, his mother is grounding him, punishing him, using the exact same tactics he uses on Butters. And he's pleading with her, begging her not to ground him, in a distressed tone. The same tone Butters uses with Steven. Think about that for a second. That's intergenerational trauma. That's the cycle of abuse, not the dramatic movie of the week kind. The quiet, ordinary, this is how we do things in, our family kind. Steven parents the way he was parented, because it's the only model he has. He doesn't know any other way. And the show even adds another layer with Grandma Stoch, who appears in Butterballs, season 16, episode 5, aired April 11th, 2012. And she's a bully. She bullies Butters directly. And Steven either doesn't notice or doesn't intervene, because on some level, He's still the kid in the flashback, terrified of his own mother, incapable of standing up to her even as an adult. So you've got 3 generations of the same pattern. Grandma Stoch terrorized Steven. Steven terrorizes Butters. And in the post-COVID specials, South Park Post-COVID, The Return of COVID, which premiered on Paramount Plus on December 16th, 2021, we see the result. Butters, as an adult, is Victor Chaos. He's institutionalized. He's insane. And when Stan and Kyle call him Butters, he says they've confused him with someone else. He calls his younger self a twerpy, little loser kid whose parents didn't love him. And here's the part that really gets me. The fact that Butters still, even after all of that, has internalized the message. Not that his parents were wrong, not that the abuse was the problem, that he, Butters, the kid, was the problem, that he was the loser, that he was unlovable, because that's what authoritarian parenting does. It doesn't teach the child that the rules are harsh. It teaches the child that they are fundamentally bad, that the punishment is deserved, that if they were just better, just more obedient, just less of a problem, the pain would stop. Butters tells himself off in the absence of his parents. The show establishes this. He scolds himself. He tells himself he's out of control. He wakes up to the sound of his own screams, which he mentions in Super Best Friends. And here's the psychological term for that. It's called an internalized critical parent. It's when the voice of the authority figure becomes your own inner voice. When you don't need someone to punish you anymore because you've learned to punish yourself. I'm sorry, but that is some of the most psychologically incisive writing in any animated series ever. And I don't think Matt and Trey get enough credit for it, because they're doing it within the framework of absurdist comedy. Butters gets sold to Paris Hilton, his mom tries to drown him, his dad buries him in an Indian burial ground, but the underlying emotional reality is brutally, painfully accurate. And speaking of Linda trying to drown Butters, I need to talk about Butters' very own episode. Season 5, episode 14, aired December 12th, 2001, because this is the episode that reveals just how deep the dysfunction in the Stoch household goes. Here's what happened. Butters discovers that his father has been visiting gay bathhouses and adult movie theaters. He innocently takes photos and brings them to his mother. Linda loses her mind. She goes through a complete psychological breakdown, and her actual response, is to attempt to murder Butters by locking him in the car and rolling it into a river. She then plans to hang herself. I need you to think about what just happened there. A child brings evidence of a parent's secret to the other parent, and the other parent's response is to kill the child, not the cheating spouse, the child, the messenger, the innocent. Because in Linda's shattered psyche, the problem isn't Steven's infidelity. The problem is that the secret is out. The problem is that the carefully maintained facade of normalcy has been cracked. And rather than face that crack, she would literally rather kill her own child and herself. That is so dark. That is so dark. And the show plays it partly for laughs, because that's what South Park does. But if you sit with it, if you really sit with it, it tells you everything about what it's like to grow up in a household where appearances matter more than reality, where the image of being a good family is more important than actually being a good family, where a child can be punished, controlled, sold, and nearly murdered, and the family's public face never changes. And both parents get away with it, by the way. No consequences, no arrests. They go to Bennigan. And Butters learns that sometimes lying is for the best. At 10 years old, this kid learns that truth is dangerous, and that the people who are supposed to protect you will choose their own comfort over your life. I think about that a lot, honestly. I think about it whenever Butters appears in later seasons, and he's still that sweet, optimistic kid. Because what the show is saying about resilience, about the human capacity to maintain hope and kindness, even in the face of consistent, systematic cruelty, is actually kind of beautiful, and also kind of heartbreaking. Because on some level, that Butters' optimism isn't just a personality trait, it's a survival mechanism. It's the only way he can get through the day. I want to take a brief detour here because I think it connects to something important. There's a concept in psychology called adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. They're usually abbreviated. It's a scoring system that measures different types of childhood trauma, and research consistently shows that the more ACEs a kid has, the more likely they are to develop physical and mental health problems as adults. Things like substance abuse, depression, relationship difficulties, chronic health condition. If you were to score Butters on the ACE scale, and people have done this, the South Park fandom has actually gotten into this. He scores absurdly high. Emotional abuse from his parents, witnessing domestic violence, because Steven and Linda's relationship is volatile and unstable. His mother's attempted murder and suicide attempt, being sold by his parents, witnessing his father's sexual behavior, having a family member who's been incarcerated or institutionalized, physical abuse, because Stephen has hit him on multiple occasions, his grandmother's bullying, the neglect of his emotional needs. And despite all of that, Butters remains Butters. And I think the reason the character resonates so deeply with people, and he's become one of the most beloved characters in the entire series, even though he started as a background character with no lines, is precisely because of that gap between what he endures and who he chooses to be. Matt Stone has described Butters as embodying permanent innocence, and there's something both inspiring and devastating about that description, because permanent innocence in the face of constant cruelty isn't just innocence. It's a kind of dissociation. It's a refusal to fully process what's happening to you, because processing it would break something inside you that you can't afford to have broken, right? So we've done the permissive parent, we've done the authoritarian parents. Now I want to talk about the family that's probably the most fun to analyze, because they're the most publicly visible, the most chaotic, and they represent something that I think a lot of people in the audience are going to recognize from their own lives. Randy and Sharon Marsh. Okay, so here's the thing about the Marsh family. If you look at early South Park, seasons 1 through, I'd say about 7, Randy is actually not a bad dad. He's kind of a normal dad, a little awkward, a little clueless, but fundamentally well-meaning. He shows up to Stan's events. He tries to have conversations with his son about puberty and drugs, even if those conversations are bumbling and uncomfortable. He's a geologist. He has a doctorate. He's educated. He and Sharon have a functional, if slightly boring, suburban marriage. And then something happens. Gradually, over the course of the series, Randy transforms from a supporting character into the show's main source of adult chaos. And Trey Parker has talked about this. Randy is based on his own father. The character's first name is Randy. Parker's dad is also named Randy. And like Randy Marsh, Parker's dad is a geologist, and Parker has described Randy Marsh as the biggest dingbat in the entire show. And what's interesting is that this evolution of Randy, from reasonable dad to complete maniac, isn't just a writing choice for comedy. It's actually a really accurate portrayal of what happens when a middle-aged man hits a certain kind of existential crisis, and his family has to deal with the fallout. So let's talk about what's psychologically going on with Randy Marsh, because there's a lot here. Randy is, first and foremost, a man with an identity problem. He doesn't know who he is outside of his family and his job. And every time he encounters something new, a trend, a hobby, a political movement, a business opportunity, he doesn't just engage with it. He disappears into it completely, obsessively, to the exclusion of everything and everyone around him. He becomes a chef and neglects his family. He becomes a rock star and shits his pants on stage. He starts a weed farm and drags his entire family to Tegrity Farms against their will. He fights at Little League games. He plays World of Warcraft obsessively. He becomes so fixated on his son's Pinewood Derby car that he steals a superconducting magnet from the Large Hadron Collider. And here's the key. Every single one of these obsessions is a substitute for the one thing Randy won't face: the fact that he's unhappy. The show makes this explicit. In You're Getting Old, Season 15, Episode 7, June 8, 2011, Sharon confronts Randy about his increasingly bizarre behavior, and Randy snaps. He doesn't make excuses. He doesn't deflect with a joke. He admits it. He says he does all these crazy things because he's unhappy, and Sharon says she's been unhappy too, and the episode ends with them separating. Fleetwood Mac's Landslide plays over a montage of their family falling apart. Stan lies alone on his bed in a new apartment. It's one of the most devastating sequences in the history of the show. And the reason it's devastating is that it's real. Not real in the "this actually happened" sense, obviously. Real in the sense that millions of families go through exactly this. A father who fills the void with one distraction after another. A mother who holds it together until she can't anymore. A child who watches his entire world reorganize around his parents' inability to communicate honestly with each other. That's not satire. That's a documentary. They just drew it with construction paper. Now, from a psychological standpoint, what would a clinician say about Randy Marsh? Here's what I think, and I've actually thought about this more than is probably healthy. Randy displays classic traits of what's sometimes informally called adult ADHD meets midlife crisis. He has poor impulse control. He has difficulty with emotional regulation. He oscillates between euphoria and despair with very little middle ground. He has an addictive personality, which the show addresses directly in the Bloody Mary episode. Season 9, Episode 14, aired December 7th, 2005, where Randy gets arrested for drunk driving and is ordered to attend Alcoholics Anonymous. And what's brilliant about that episode, and this is one of my favorite bits of writing in the entire series, is that the AA meetings actually make Randy worse, because they tell him alcoholism is a disease, that he's powerless. And Randy, being Randy, takes that as permission to drink more, because if it's a disease, it's not his fault. And if it's not his fault, he doesn't have to change. And it's Stan, 10-year-old Stan, who has to be the adult in the room, who has to tell his father that if he devotes his whole life to completely avoiding something he likes, that thing still controls his life, and he's never learned any discipline at all. Stan tells his dad that the answer isn't total abstinence or total inebriation. The answer is moderation. And Trey Parker has confirmed in DVD commentary that this scene was based on a near identical experience he went through with his own dad when he was around 9 years old. I need you to think about that. A 9-year-old kid having to counsel his father on responsible drinking. That's parentification. That's role reversal. That's a child being forced to take on emotional responsibilities that no child should have to carry. And the show does it with Stan and Randy again and again and again. Stan is constantly the reasonable one, the mature one, the one who sees through Randy's nonsense when no other adult in South Park will call it out. And that tells you everything about what it's like to be the child of a parent who can't stop being a child themselves. You grow up fast, not because you want to, because someone has to be the grown-up, and your actual grown-up is too busy fighting at Little League games, or becoming a celebrity chef, or buying a Blockbuster. And here's where Sharon enters the picture. And I think Sharon Marsh is one of the most underappreciated characters in the entire show from a psychological standpoint. Sharon is the enabler. Now, I want to be careful with that word, because enabler has gotten thrown around so much in pop psychology that it's lost some of its meaning. But in the clinical sense, an enabler is someone who, through their own patterns of accommodation, silence, and occasionally explosive frustration, allows dysfunctional behavior to continue. Not because they approve of it, but because confronting it, really confronting it, feels more frightening than adapting to it. And that's Sharon. For most of the show's run, Sharon's role in the Marsh household has been to sigh, to roll her eyes, to occasionally snap at Randy, and then to go along with whatever he's doing anyway. She's the one who packs up the kitchen when they separate. She's the one who unpacks the boxes in the new apartment. She's the one who keeps the household functional while Randy is off doing whatever Randy is doing, and she doesn't leave. Even when she does leave, in You're Getting Old, she comes back. By Ass Burgers, the very next episode, Season 15, Episode 8, aired October 5th, 2011. Randy and Sharon have reconciled. They've remarried. And the show explicitly frames this as both of them choosing comfortable unhappiness over the terrifying uncertainty of real change. Sharon is named after Trey Parker's actual mother, by the way, and Parker's real mother is an insurance broker, while Sharon in the show works as a receptionist at Tom's Rhinoplasty. But the core dynamic, the patient, long-suffering wife of a man who keeps creating chaos, feels deeply personal. And here's what a psychologist would say about the Marsh marriage. It's codependent. Not in the dramatic soap opera sense, in the quiet, lived-in sense. Randy needs chaos to avoid feeling his unhappiness. Sharon needs to manage Randy's chaos, to feel useful and in control. And their kid, Stan, is caught in the middle, triangulated into a mediator role that damages him in ways the show actually explores. Because Stan develops cynicism. That's the entire premise of You're Getting Old. Stan turns 10, and suddenly everything looks and sounds like crap to him. And while the show plays this as a metaphor for growing up, for the inevitable loss of childlike wonder, there's a deeper reading. Stan's cynicism isn't just about getting older. It's about growing up in a household where one parent is a source of constant embarrassment and chaos, and the other parent won't leave. Where the adults around you are, as Sharon puts it, going through the same ridiculous shit every week. That wears on a kid. That teaches a kid that the world is fundamentally absurd, and that you can't trust the people who are supposed to protect you to actually protect you from anything, including themselves. And in the episodes following You're Getting Old, Stan starts drinking. At 10 years old, he discovers that alcohol makes everything not seem like crap anymore. And neither of his parents, neither the father, who has his own drinking problem, nor the mother, who is supposedly the responsible one, catches it, because they're too wrapped up in their own patterns to see what's happening to their son. I mean, think about that. Randy Marsh, who was forced to attend AA and give speeches about the dangers of drinking, doesn't notice his own 10-year-old son self-medicating with alcohol. That's not funny. I mean, it is funny, because it's South Park and they make it funny, but it's also a perfect, scalpel-precise illustration of how parental dysfunction creates blind spots. You can be so consumed by your own issues that you literally cannot see the same issues developing in your child. I've been rewatching these episodes a lot lately, and you know what hits different on a rewatch? The quiet moments, the moments between the jokes. There's this recurring thing the show does where the camera will hold on Stan's face for just a beat longer than you expect. And in that beat, you see something that isn't a joke. You see a kid who's tired, a kid who's watching his dad be ridiculous and his mom be frustrated, and who has just accepted it, resigned himself to it. And that resignation, that acceptance of, this is just how things are, that's the real damage, not the chaos itself, the normalization of the chaos. All right, let me shift gears again because I want to talk about a family that operates on a completely different psychological axis. And I find them fascinating because they represent something that doesn't get discussed enough in conversations about parenting, which is the damage that comes not from neglect or abuse or permissiveness, but from excessive moral certainty. Gerald and Sheila Broflovski. On the surface, the Broflovskis look like the best parents on the show. They're upper middle class. Gerald's a lawyer. They're educated. They're involved in their kids' lives. They have conversations about values and religion and ethics. They have 2 kids, Kyle, who's 10, and Ike, who's adopted from Canada and is around 3 or 4. They're a 2-parent household with stable finances and a strong community presence. By every metric most people would use to evaluate parents, the Broflovskis should be the gold standard. And in some ways, they are. Kyle is probably the most morally centered of the 4 boys. He has a strong sense of right and wrong. He stands up for what he believes in. He's articulate. He's passionate. He's empathetic. You can see Sheila and Gerald's influence in all of that. But here's the thing, and this is where it gets psychologically interesting. The Broflovskis also produce a child who is constantly anxious, who has angry outbursts, who is in a perpetual state of moral crisis, who takes on the weight of the world's injustices as if they're his personal responsibility. And a psychologist would look at Kyle's behavior patterns and say, this is a kid who grew up in a household where moral urgency was treated as a personality trait. Let me explain what I mean by that. Sheila Broflovski, and I want to be fair here, because the show's portrayal of Sheila has evolved significantly over the years. Sheila starts out as essentially a caricature of the overbearing Jewish mother. She's loud. She's morally outraged. She's controlling. Her catchphrase is literally, what? Shouted at increasing volume whenever she encounters something offensive. In the South Park movie, Bigger, Longer, and Uncut, released June 30th, 1999, she basically starts a war with Canada because her son heard some bad words on TV. She founds Mothers Against Canada. She pushes the President of the United States aside to lecture the country. And by the end of the movie, she's realized that she brought enough intolerance to the world to allow the literal second coming of Satan. Now, early Sheila is basically played for laughs. She's the overprotective mom, the moral crusader, the woman who sees an injustice and immediately escalates to DEFCON 1. And the comedy comes from the gap between the mildness of the offense and the extremity of her response. But as the show matured, Sheila's characterization got more nuanced. And this is where the psychology gets rich. Because Sheila isn't just overprotective. She's a specific kind of overprotective. She's morally protective. She doesn't just want to keep her kids safe from physical harm. She wants to keep them safe from wrong ideas, wrong influences, wrong values. And in doing so, she inadvertently teaches Kyle that the world is a constant moral battlefield, and that the appropriate response to anything you disagree with is total war. Look at Kyle. Really look at him across the series. What does he do? He hears about an injustice, and he immediately has to fix it. He has to correct it. He has to go on a crusade. And when he can't fix it, when the world turns out to be more complicated than right and wrong, he becomes furious, or despairing, or both. Kyle is a kid who inherited his mother's moral certainty without the life experience to handle the inevitable disappointments that come with it. And Gerald. Let me talk about Gerald for a second, because Gerald Broflovski is a study in the gap between who a person presents themselves as and who they actually are. Gerald presents as a reasonable, educated, liberal professional. He's a lawyer. He cares about the community. He teaches his son about values and ethics. But the show has consistently revealed, over multiple seasons, that Gerald has a shadow side that completely undermines everything he claims to stand for. In Chickenpox, Season 2, Episode 10, August 26, 1998, Gerald reveals his views on class and poverty. His childhood friend, Stuart McCormick, is poor. Their friendship fell apart because Gerald became successful and Stuart didn't. And when Kyle asks his father about the disparity, Gerald gives him this speech about gods and clods, about how society needs some people to be poor so others can be rich. And Kyle, being Kyle, takes this to its logical conclusion and writes a paper called The Final Solution, about putting poor people in camps. And Gerald reads it and realizes what he's actually been teaching his son. That moment, that single moment, is one of the most devastating commentaries on privileged liberal hypocrisy that South Park has ever produced. Gerald talks about equality and justice. But underneath, he believes in a hierarchy. He believes some people deserve to be at the bottom. And he's passing that belief on to his son in ways he doesn't even recognize. And then season 20 happened. Season 20, which aired from September 14th to December 7th, 2016. Gerald Broflovski is revealed to be Skankhunt42, an internet troll, a man who has been going online, drinking red wine, listening to Boston, and posting horrible things about women, making provocative statements, putting offensive images in people's mouths. And he's been doing it for fun, for the rush, for the feeling of power, and nobody suspects him because he's Gerald Broflovski. He's the reasonable one, the educated one, the lawyer. A psychologist would have a field day with Gerald's trolling behavior because what it reveals is a man with a carefully maintained public persona who is, privately, deeply frustrated by the constraints of that persona. The trolling isn't random cruelty, it's a release valve. It's the place where all the things Gerald can't say in his real life, the provocative thoughts, the transgressive impulses, the desire to tear things down, find an outlet. And the fact that he does it anonymously, that he needs the mask of Skankhunt42 to express these parts of himself, tells you that Gerald has compartmentalized his personality in a way that is psychologically unsustainable. And here's what's interesting about how this connects to his parenting. Gerald teaches Kyle to be moral, to be righteous, to stand up for what's right. But Gerald himself doesn't actually live by those values. He lives by the appearance of those values. And on some level, Kyle knows this. Kyle can sense the disconnect, even if he can't articulate it. And that disconnect between what a parent says and what a parent does is one of the most corrosive things a child can experience, because it teaches the child that morality is performance, that the right thing to do and the thing you actually do can be completely different, and that's just how people work. And Sheila's role in all of this is complicated by the fact that she genuinely does care. She's not performing. She really does believe in the things she fights for. But her care comes wrapped in such controlling, explosive emotional intensity that it often does more harm than good. She starts wars over TV shows. She forces the school nativity to adopt a non-offensive theme and provokes a riot. She chases her kids through the house when she discovers her husband's trolling activity. The Broflovski household, from a psychological standpoint, is a house of contradiction, high values, inconsistent practice, deep love, suffocating control, moral education, paired with moral hypocrisy. And Kyle, caught in the middle of all of it, becomes this fascinating, deeply conflicted character. A kid who desperately wants to be good, but who is constantly confronting evidence that being good isn't enough, that the world doesn't reward goodness the way his parents promised it would, and that the people he trusts most are capable of the very things they taught him to despise. Remember what I said at the beginning about how the most damaging parenting comes not from parents who don't care, but from parents who care in the wrong way. The Broflovskis are the perfect illustration. They care so much, too much, in some ways. And the pressure of all that caring, the pressure to be right, to be moral, to be the family that stands for something, produces a kid who carries the weight of the world on his 10-year-old shoulders and doesn't know how to put it down. Okay, I want to talk about the McCormicks now. And I'm going to be honest with you. This is the section that's the hardest for me to talk about. Not because the material is thin, because it's too real. Stuart and Carol McCormick are, by any clinical measure, neglectful parents. But they're not the cartoon version of neglect, where the parent is some mustache-twirling villain who actively hates their kid. They're the real version. The version where the parents are so consumed by their own pathology, in this case, addiction, poverty, and the generational trauma that comes with both, that they simply don't have the resources to give their children what they need. The McCormicks live in a dilapidated house that Stuart and Gerald Broflovski literally built together as teenagers. It's falling apart. The car in the front yard is dismantled. There are stray animals everywhere. The family's most advanced technology is a ColecoVision plugged into a monochrome TV. They eat frozen waffles for dinner with no side dishes, Pop-Tarts, bread sandwiches. In Starvin' Marvin, Season 1, Episode 8, November 19th, 1997, Kenny wins a can of green beans for his family, and they can't afford a can opener. Stuart is a chronic alcoholic. Carol is also a heavy drinker. They fight constantly, physically, violently, in front of their children. In Chicken Lover, Season 2, Episode 3, May 27th, 1998, they appear on an episode of Cops, beating each other up while Kenny and his older brother Kevin watch and laugh. And that detail, the kids watching and laughing, is one of the most haunting things the show has ever done, because that's normalization. That's kids who have seen their parents fight so many times that it's entertainment now. It's background noise. It doesn't even register as unusual. And here's the thing that makes the McCormick family dynamic so psychologically complex. Despite everything, despite the poverty, the alcoholism, the fighting, the meth lab in the backyard that gets them arrested in The Poor Kid, Season 15, Episode 14, November 16th, 2011. Stuart and Carol aren't bad people. They're damaged people. And the show goes out of its way to show moments of genuine love between them. In Cartman Joins NAMBLA, Season 4, Episode 5, June 21st, 2000. Stuart and Carol decide to have another child. They're happy about it. They're excited. And when Kenny tries to prevent the pregnancy, in a typically dark South Park subplot, where he's trying to prevent being replaced, Stuart drinks the abortion pill cocktail himself because Carol can't drink during pregnancy, and he gets sick. And Carol is worried about him because she loves him, even though they beat each other up, even though they're both alcoholics, even though they can't afford to feed the kids they already have. There's genuine love there. And I think that's the key to understanding what the show is saying about the McCormicks. Poverty doesn't destroy love. Addiction doesn't destroy love. But both of them destroy the capacity to act on love. Stuart loves his kids. He's never shown being intentionally cruel to them, but his alcoholism consumes the resources, financial, emotional, psychological, that his children need to thrive. Carol loves her kids. She shows physical affection to Karen, the youngest, in several episodes. But her own drinking and her volatile relationship with Stuart create an environment of chaos and unpredictability that no child can grow up in without being affected. And look at how the three McCormick children turn out, because this is where the show's psychological insight really shines. Kevin, the oldest, is barely present. He fades into the background. He doesn't excel, doesn't rebel, doesn't do anything visible. He's a ghost. And that is absolutely consistent with what psychologists call the invisible child role in dysfunctional families. The child who copes by making themselves as small and unnoticeable as possible, because drawing attention to yourself in a volatile household is dangerous. Karen, the youngest, is terrified. She clings to Kenny. She's quiet. She relies on her siblings in ways that she should be able to rely on her parents. Kenny literally takes on a superhero identity, Mysterion, partly to protect Karen. He scares his own parents into treating the kids better, paying them an allowance, not getting high at night. A child is parenting his parents into being parents. And then there's Kenny himself. And here's what gets me about Kenny McCormick. Kenny is brave. He's selfless. He literally dies over and over again, sacrificing himself, enduring impossible horror, and keeps coming back. And the show reveals, in the Mysterion trilogy, Coon 2, Hindsight, Mysterion Rises, and Coon vs. Coon and Friends, all in Season 14, airing November 3rd, 10th, and 17th, 2010, that Kenny views his immortality as a curse, not a gift. A curse because he dies and nobody remembers. He suffers and it doesn't count. And I'm going to say something here that might sound like I'm reaching, but I genuinely believe it. Kenny's relationship with death in the show is a metaphor for what it's like to grow up in a neglectful household. You go through terrible things, you suffer, and the world doesn't notice. Your parents don't notice. Your friends don't notice. You come back the next day and everything resets, and nobody acknowledges what happened to you. And you learn that your pain is invisible, that your suffering doesn't matter to the people around you. And the only thing you can do is keep going. Kenny keeps going through everything, through the poverty and the fighting and the freezing cold and the deaths. And I think that's why he's such a beloved character, even though he barely speaks, because a lot of people recognize that feeling. The feeling of getting up every morning in a household where the adults can't take care of themselves, let alone you, and just going to school, putting on your coat, standing at the bus stop, getting through the day. And the show even gives us a beautiful glimpse of who Kenny really is beneath the parka. In Best Friends Forever, Season 9, Episode 4, March 30th, 2005, Kenny gets the newest PSP, goes to heaven, and is appointed to lead heaven's armies against hell because he's the bravest soul heaven has ever encountered. The kid from the poorest family in town. The kid nobody pays attention to. The kid whose parents can't afford dinner. He's the bravest soul in the universe, and his parents will never know because they're too drunk to notice. I'm going to take a second here because I realize we've been going pretty deep, and it's a lot. If you've made it this far, you already know this isn't a light video. So take a breath, get comfortable. We've still got ground to cover. I want to zoom out for a minute and talk about something structural, something that connects all of these families together. Because one of the things that makes South Park's portrayal of parenting so effective is that it's not just showing individual dysfunctional families in isolation. It's showing a community of dysfunctional families. And within that community, the parents interact with each other. They reinforce each other's worst tendencies. They create an ecosystem of dysfunction that no single family exists outside of. Think about how the parents of South Park behave as a group. They panic together. They make terrible decisions together. They start wars together. They abandon their children to chase fads together. They protest things, mob things, worship things, flee from things all together. And the kids are left to fend for themselves. There's this recurring pattern in the show where the adults of South Park collectively lose their minds over something. And the children, who are supposed to be the immature ones, are the ones who have to solve the problem. The adults are scared of SARS and barricade themselves in. The adults become obsessed with the Chin Pokemon fad while a Japanese plot unfolds. The adults join a timeshare scheme and can't say no. The adults go to war with Canada over a movie. And every single time, it's the kids who see clearly. It's Stan who talks sense into Randy. It's Kyle who recognizes the injustice. It's Kenny who makes the sacrifice. It's even Cartman who, in his own twisted way, pursues a goal with more focus and determination than any adult around him. And what that tells you, psychologically, is that South Park is fundamentally a show about parentification, about what happens when an entire generation of children has to raise themselves because the generation above them is too frightened, too distracted, too addicted, or too narcissistic to do the job. And I think that's why the show resonates so deeply with millennials and Gen Z. Because a lot of people watching South Park grew up with parents who, in one way or another, dropped the ball. Not always dramatically, not always in ways that make for good stories. Sometimes just in the quiet, everyday ways. The parent who is always on their phone. The parent who is always at work. The parent who is always fighting with the other parent. The parent who treated you like a therapist. And when you see Stan Marsh standing there, waiting for his dad to stop being ridiculous, there's a recognition, a familiarity. That's not just a cartoon kid. That's you, at the dinner table, waiting for the adults to be adults. This is something I think about randomly at like 2 a.m., honestly. Like, the fact that a show about construction paper characters has accidentally produced the most honest commentary on modern American parenting in the last 30 years. And nobody talks about it because the show also has a talking piece of poo. Okay, let me talk about something specific now, because I want to dig into a few episodes that I think are particularly revealing when it comes to parenting psychology. And I want to start with one that people don't bring up enough in this context. The Losing Edge, Season 9, Episode 5, April 6th, 2005. On the surface, this is a straightforward parody episode. The boys are playing Little League Baseball, and the joke is that they're trying to lose because none of them actually want to play. The main story follows the boys attempting to throw games while accidentally winning. It's very funny. But the B plot, which is really the A plot in terms of what it's saying about parenting, is about Randy Marsh at the games. Specifically, about Randy getting into drunken fistfights with the fathers of kids on opposing teams. And this isn't framed as a one-time occurrence. It's framed as a pattern. Randy takes personal pride in these fights. He trains for them. He treats them as a matter of personal honor. And the fights escalate throughout the episode, becoming increasingly violent and ridiculous. And Stan, who is supposed to be the one playing baseball, is mortified. He doesn't care about the games. He cares about his dad making a spectacle of himself again, and nobody does anything about it. The other adults treat Randy's behavior as just a thing that happens. Sharon isn't shown intervening. The community doesn't address it. And here's what's psychologically insightful about this episode. It's about a parent who uses their child's activities as a stage for their own unresolved emotional needs. Randy doesn't come to the games for Stan. He comes for himself, for the adrenaline, for the feeling of importance, for the excuse to drink and fight and feel alive in a way his suburban geologist life doesn't normally allow. And Stan's experience, Stan's feelings about the game, Stan's discomfort is completely irrelevant. He's a prop, a reason for Randy to be at the field. And that, a parent who uses their child's world as a vehicle for their own needs, is one of the most common forms of emotional narcissism in parenting. And it doesn't look like abuse. It doesn't look like neglect. From the outside, it looks like an involved parent, a dad who shows up to every game. But the child knows. The child always knows the difference between a parent who's there for them and a parent who's there for themselves. And that brings me to another episode I keep coming back to. Something You Can Do With Your Finger, Season 4, Episode 9, July 19th, 2000. In this episode, Stan wants to start a boy band with his friend, and Randy is furious about it. Not because he thinks boy bands are stupid, though he does, but because Randy was in a boy band when he was a teenager, and it went badly, and the trauma of that failure is so unprocessed, so raw, even decades later, that he can't separate his own experience from his son's choices. And eventually, Randy does what he always does. He hijacks the situation. He joins Stan's boy band. And I mean literally joins it. He becomes a member of Fingerbang when Kenny is killed by an elevator at the South Park Mall. And this is such a perfect illustration of a concept called enmeshment, where a parent is so emotionally intertwined with their child that they can't allow the child to have their own separate experiences. If Stan wants to do something, Randy has to be part of it. If Stan is experiencing something, Randy is experiencing it too. Or, more accurately, Randy's version of it, filtered through his own unresolved baggage. The child's autonomy is swallowed up by the parent's emotional needs. And here's what I find so interesting about the evolution of the Marsh family dynamic over the full run of the series. In the early seasons, Randy is on the periphery. He's a supporting character. Stan is the focus. And the show's orientation is from the child's perspective. The adults are background noise, making occasional appearances to be stupid or embarrassing or unhelpful. But as the show progresses, Randy gradually moves to the center. He gets more screen time, more storyline. More of the episodes are about him. And by the time we get to the Tegrity Farms era, starting in season 22, 2018, the show is essentially about Randy, with the boys as supporting players. And I think that mirrors, intentionally or not, what happens in a family with a narcissistic parent. The narcissistic parent gradually becomes the center of everything. The child's world contracts. Their needs, their stories, their experiences, they all become secondary to the parent's drama. The family's emotional energy is organized around the parent's mood, the parent's projects, the parent's crises, and the child learns to make themselves small, to accommodate, to be the audience for the parent's life instead of the protagonist of their own. Stan Marsh started the show as the main character, the everyman, the normal kid, and over the course of 30 years, his father slowly, steadily pushed him to the margins of his own story. If that isn't a metaphor for growing up with an emotionally immature parent, I don't know what is. Let me circle back to something I mentioned earlier about the Stoches, because there's one more dimension to their parenting that I think is crucial, and it's about Stephen Stoch's sexuality. The show has established, across multiple episodes, that Stephen is bisexual. He visits gay bathhouses and adult movie theater. He cheats on Linda with men. And his response to being caught is not self-reflection or honesty. It's shame. It's denial. It's blaming the internet. And ultimately, it's rage directed at the person who caught him, his own son. Now, I want to be clear about something. There is nothing psychologically pathological about being bisexual. That's not what the show is saying, and it's not what I'm saying. What is psychologically significant is the repression, the hiding, the fact that Stephen has constructed an entire identity around being a certain kind of man, a strict, controlling, traditional father, and that identity requires the suppression of a fundamental part of who he is. And here's where it gets really interesting, because a psychologist would tell you that the more rigidly a person controls their external environment, the more likely it is that they're compensating for a loss of control internally. Stephen controls Butters because Stephen can't control himself. He imposes strict rules on his son because the rules inside his own head are crumbling. He punishes Butters for the smallest infractions because, on some level, he's punishing himself. For the bathhouses, for the desires he can't admit to, for the gap between who he is and who he thinks he should be. And Butters absorbs all of it. He absorbs the punishment. He absorbs the shame. He absorbs the message that there's something wrong with him, something that needs to be controlled and contained and grounded. And the tragedy is that none of it, none of the grounding, none of the discipline, none of the control has anything to do with Butters. It's all about Stephen. But Butters doesn't know that. He thinks it's about him. He thinks he's the problem. That dynamic, the parent who projects their own shame onto their child, and the child who internalizes it, is one of the most damaging patterns in psychology. And the reason it's so damaging is that the child can never fix it. No matter how good Butters is, no matter how obedient, no matter how perfectly he reorganizes the pantry, it will never be enough. Because the problem isn't his behavior. The problem is his father's self-hatred. And you can't discipline self-hatred out of someone else's child. This is one of those things where every time I rewatch these Stoch episodes, I notice something new. Like in Cartman Sucks, Season 11, Episode 2, March 14, 2007, where Butters gets sent to a conversion camp because his father walks in on a compromising photo situation with Cartman. And at the camp, Butters meets Bradley, a kid who's struggling with his sexual orientation. Bradley is so conflicted and ashamed that he tries to jump off a bridge, and Butters stops him with a speech. Butters, the most abused kid in town, stands up and tells the camp workers that they're not confused. They're just a little bit curious, and that's okay. And I need you to notice what happens there. Butters gives Bradley the acceptance that Stephen never gave himself. Butters extends compassion about sexuality to a stranger that his own father can't extend to his own reflection. And Butters does it naturally, instinctively, without effort. Because despite everything Stephen and Linda have done to him, Butters' fundamental nature is kindness. And honestly, that might be the most optimistic thing South Park has ever said about the human condition. That even a childhood defined by authoritarian control and emotional abuse can produce someone who instinctively reaches out to help another person in pain. That damage isn't destiny. That the cycle can be broken, not because the system worked, but because something in Butters, some irreducible core of decency, survived. I want to talk about something that I don't think anyone else has connected in quite this way. And it's about the relationship between the parenting styles in South Park and the way the show itself has evolved over time. Here's what I mean. In the early seasons, let's say seasons 1 through 5, roughly 1997 to 2001, the show's focus is on the children. The parents are supporting characters. They appear mostly in domestic scenes or community meetings. The show is interested in how kids experience the world, the confusion, the curiosity, the casual cruelty of the playground, the bewildering behavior of the adults around them. And in this era, the parents are mostly played as straightforward obstacles or punchline. Randy is the goofy dad. Sheila is the overprotective mom. Leanne is the promiscuous joke. The McCormicks are the poor family. The Stoches barely exist yet. But as the show matures, something shifts. The parents become more complex. Their motivations become more visible. Their flaws become more specific and more real. And crucially, the children start to be affected by those flaws in ways that the show takes seriously, not just as comedy. I think the turning point is around seasons 5 and 6, Butters' very own episode in season 5, Kenny's permanent death, and Butters' rise as a replacement in season 6. These are the episodes where the show starts saying, these families have real dynamics, these parents are doing real damage, and the kids are not okay. And from there, the evolution continues. By the time you get to seasons 9 and 10, Bloody Mary, the losing edge. The show is as interested in the parents as the children. The emotional complexity has deepened enormously. And by season 15, you're getting old. The show is capable of producing a moment so emotionally honest that viewers thought it was a series finale. And I think the reason for that evolution is that Trey Parker and Matt Stone were growing up alongside their show. They started making South Park when they were in their mid-20s. Young men, kids really, in some ways. And as they got older, as they became parents themselves, as they watched their own friends become parents, as they started to understand the dynamics of their own childhood, the show reflected that growth. Trey Parker has talked about how Randy Marsh became his favorite character to write because, as Parker aged, he identified more with the adults. He went from seeing the world through Stan's eyes to seeing it through Randy's. And that shift, from child to parent, from observer to participant, from my dad is embarrassing to I am someone's embarrassing dad, gave the show a depth and a sadness that it didn't have in its early years. And I think that sadness is what makes later South Park so powerful, because early South Park is fearless and hilarious and shocking. But later South Park is something else. It's knowing. It understands that the adults aren't just stupid. They're scared. They're lonely. They're doing their best with what they have, and what they have isn't enough. And the comedy comes not from the adults being cartoonishly foolish, but from the recognition that this, all of this, is painfully, uncomfortably familiar. Okay, let me get into something I've been wanting to talk about since the beginning of this video. And it's about the one parent who might be the most dangerous of all. Not the most dramatic. Not the most obviously dysfunctional. The most dangerous. And that's Sheila Broflovski. Now, I already talked about Sheila in the context of the Broflovski family dynamics, but I want to zoom in on her specifically because I think she represents a parenting archetype that is extremely common in real life and almost never discussed honestly: the morally righteous helicopter parent. Here's what makes Sheila dangerous, psychologically speaking. She genuinely believes she's doing the right thing every time. She doesn't have the self-awareness of a Randy, who at least occasionally admits he's unhappy or acting crazy. She doesn't have the resignation of a Sharon, who knows things are wrong but doesn't know how to fix them. Sheila is certain in every situation about everything, and certainty, when it's combined with power and a willingness to act, is one of the most destructive forces in parenting. Because a parent who is never wrong is a parent who cannot learn, who cannot grow, who cannot adapt, who cannot hear their child's actual needs, because they've already decided what those needs are. Sheila started a war to protect her child from hearing bad words. Think about the scale of that response. Her son heard swear words from a Canadian comedy duo, and Sheila's response was to found an advocacy organization, lobby the government, push the president aside to lecture the nation, and ultimately contribute to a military conflict. And at no point in this escalation did she stop and ask, is my response proportional to the threat? And the movie makes it clear that this is a pattern. Cartman notes that Sheila gets worked up about something once a month. A joke about menstruation, yes, but also a commentary on the cyclical nature of her moral crusades. She's always fighting something, always outraged about something, always mobilizing against something, and Kyle is always caught in the wake. There's this concept in psychology called moral injury. It's usually applied to soldiers or first responders, but I think it applies here. Moral injury is the trauma that results from witnessing or being forced to participate in actions that violate your deeply held moral beliefs. And I think Kyle experiences a version of moral injury, not from warfare, but from his mother. Because Kyle has to watch his mother do things, terrible things, disproportionate things, destructive things, in the name of morality, in the name of protecting him. And he has to reconcile the love he feels for her with the harm she causes. And that creates a specific kind of psychological conflict that is extremely difficult to resolve, because you can't be angry at someone who is hurting people to protect you. The anger has nowhere to go, so it turns inward. And I think that's part of why Kyle is such an anxious, volatile character. The anger he can't direct at his mother comes out sideways, at Cartman, at injustice, at the world. I mean, look at Blame Canada from the movie. Sheila is leading a crusade against an entire country. She's advocating for the execution of Terrence and Philip. She has a V-chip installed in Cartman that electrocutes him when he swears. And all of it, is framed as maternal love, as protection, as I'm doing this for the children. And Kyle can see that it's wrong. He's fighting against it alongside his friends for the entire movie. But he can't fully oppose his mother. He can't fully separate from her because she's his mother and she loves him. And she's doing all of this terrible stuff because she loves him. That bind, the bind of being loved destructively, is something a lot of people carry their whole lives. And I think it's why Kyle's emotional outbursts feel so intense, because they're not just about whatever's happening in the moment. They're about the accumulated frustration of growing up with a mother whose love feels like a cage. Let me take a breath here and talk about something lighter for a second, because I realize this video has gotten pretty heavy. And I think the thing about South Park is that it balances all of this darkness with genuine humor and warmth. The show loves these characters, even the worst one, even the parents who are doing terrible things. And I think one of the reasons the show works as late night sleep content, which is what many of you are probably using it for right now, is that underneath all the shock humor and the social commentary and the fart jokes, there's a warmth. A genuine affection for these screwed up families and their screwed up lives. Because Matt and Trey know that family is messy, that parents are imperfect, that nobody gets it right all the time. And the show doesn't judge these parents from some position of moral superiority. It observes them. It finds them funny and sad and human and ridiculous. And it trusts the audience to draw their own conclusions. And if you think about it, that approach, that refusal to moralize, that commitment to showing rather than telling, is itself a model of a certain kind of parenting. It's what happens when a storyteller trusts their audience the way a good parent trusts their child. You don't lecture, you don't control, you create a space, you populate it with honest observations, and you let the person experiencing it come to their own understanding. All right, let me come back to the analysis, because there are a few more things I want to explore before we start wrapping this up. I want to talk about the theme of addiction across the South Park parents, because addiction is woven through almost every family in the show, and the way it's handled is, I think, one of the most honest portrayals on television. Randy's alcoholism is the most obvious. Let me go deeper on this because there's a thread here I don't want to lose. Randy's relationship with alcohol, specifically in the context of his relationship with Stan, is one of the most layered things the show has ever done. In Bloody Mary, which aired December 7th, 2005, the whole thing starts because Randy picks the boys up from karate class while drunk. He's driving. He has children in the car. Stan's friends are in the car, and he gets pulled over and arrested in front of his son's friend at night with his pants falling down. And the next day, Randy has to give a speech at Stan's school about the dangers of drunk driving. And the teacher, this is while Garrison is presenting as female, humiliates him by repeatedly calling him Stan's dad to twist the knife, and Stan is sitting there, in his seat, in front of his classmates, watching his father be publicly degraded for something that could have killed all of them the night before. I need you to think about what that does to a kid. Not in the abstract. Really think about it. Your father is drunk. He drives you and your friends home. He gets arrested. The next morning, he's standing in your classroom, explaining to your peers why what he did was dangerous. And then the teacher mocks him, and you can't say anything. You can't defend him because what he did was indefensible. You can't attack him because he's your father, and you love him, and he's already being punished. So you just sit there, and you absorb it. And here's what Trey Parker confirmed in the DVD commentary. This was based on a real experience. Parker said Randy getting arrested for drunk driving was based on something near identical that happened with his own father when Trey was around 9 years old. 9 years old. Think about that. The guy who created one of the most successful animated shows in history was once a kid in the back seat while his drunk dad got pulled over. And he took that experience, that shame, that confusion, that specific mixture of love and anger and helplessness, and he turned it into comedy. He turned it into something millions of people could watch and recognize and laugh at and feel understood by. And that's the alchemy of South Park. It takes real pain and transmutes it into something else, something you can look at without looking away, something that's funny enough to bear. But the most important part of Bloody Mary isn't the drunk driving or the AA meetings or even the Virgin Mary subplot. It's the ending. It's Stan's speech to his father, where he says, paraphrasing, that if you devote your whole life to completely avoiding something you like, that thing still controls your life, and you've never learned any discipline at all. That the answer is moderation. That the answer is figuring out how to live with something difficult instead of either surrendering to it or running from it. And that's a 10-year-old talking. That's a child who has had to think more carefully about addiction and self-control than the actual Alcoholics Anonymous group his father attended. Because the adults in the AA meeting couldn't give Randy this insight. They could only give him categories. You're an alcoholic. You're powerless. Only God can save you. And those categories didn't help because they didn't account for the complexity of Randy's relationship with alcohol. But Stan could see it because Stan lives with it every day. He sees the good Randy and the bad Randy and the in-between Randy. He sees the whole person. And from that vantage point, the answer isn't abstinence or indulgence. It's the unglamorous, difficult daily work of choosing moderation. And here's what kills me. Randy takes Stan's advice. In that moment, he really hears his son. He puts Stan on his shoulders and they walk into the sunset, discussing what a reasonable amount of drinking looks like. It's beautiful. It's one of the warmest father-son moments in the entire series. And then it doesn't stick, because by subsequent seasons, Randy is drinking again, fighting at baseball game, getting into trouble. The lesson didn't hold, and the show doesn't comment on this directly, doesn't make a big deal of it. It just moves on, the way families do, the way real parents do when they have a breakthrough, and then slowly, imperceptibly, slide back into old pattern. And the child watches and learns, once again, that their insight, their love, their intervention, it wasn't enough. That's a painful thing to learn. And Stan learns it over and over. I want to talk about another dimension of the Marsh family that doesn't get enough attention, and that's Sheila Marsh, Stan's older sister. Because Sheila tells you a lot about what happens to the other child in a family dominated by a narcissistic parent. Sheila is angry, consistently, unrelentingly angry. She beats Stan up regularly. She calls him a turd. She's hostile to almost everyone. And the show mostly plays this for laughs. She's the annoying older sister, the bully sibling. But if you look at her through a psychological lens, Shelley's behavior makes complete sense. In a family where Randy consumes all the emotional oxygen, the other children have two options: become invisible or become loud. Stan chose one path. He became the reasonable one, the mediator, the kid who steps in when the adults fail. Sheila chose the other. She became the angry one, the one who acts out, the one whose behavior demands attention, even if that attention is negative, because negative attention is still attention. And in a household where dad is constantly the center of drama and mom is constantly managing dad, a kid like Sheila, who doesn't have Stan's friend group, who doesn't have Stan's adventures, who is mostly stuck at home, has to fight for any kind of acknowledgement at all. And the way she fights is through aggression. Sharon barely intervenes in Shelley's treatment of Stan. Think about that. A mother who will sometimes stand up to her husband's craziness, but won't protect her younger child from her older child's physical abuse. And I think the reason is that Sharon is exhausted. Her emotional resources are depleted by managing Randy. She doesn't have the bandwidth to also referee her children. So Shelley's aggression becomes another thing that's just tolerated, part of the background noise of the Marsh household. And the show gives us one devastating detail about Shelley that I think explains everything. In Cat Orgy, Season 3, Episode 7, July 14th, 1999, part of the Meteor Shower trilogy, Shelley has a boyfriend, Skylar. He's older, he's in a band, and he's using her. He's dismissive. He doesn't care about her. And when he eventually breaks up with her at a party, in front of people, Shelley is heartbroken. And here's the thing, nobody comforts her. Her parents aren't there. They're at a meteor shower party. Her brother is her punching bag, not her confidant. She has to process that rejection entirely alone. And she processes it the only way she knows how, with anger, with violence, with the blunt force emotional toolkit that's the only one available to her. Shelley Marsh is what happens to the forgotten child. The one who isn't the golden child, or the scapegoat, or the mediator. She's just there, existing on the margins of a family that's too consumed by its own central drama to notice she's drowning. Now, while we're talking about siblings, let me circle back to the McCormick family, because I want to talk about Karen McCormick and what she represents in the show's psychological framework. Karen is Kenny's younger sister. She's small, she's quiet, she's scared. And Kenny, a kid who can't even consistently feed himself, whose parents are drunk and fighting, who dies over and over again. Kenny takes care of her. He protects her. He has literally created a superhero alter ego, Mysterion, that exists partly to give Karen a guardian angel. There's a scene, I think it's in The Poor Kid, where Karen is in the soft room at the foster care facility after her parents have been arrested for running a meth lab, and she asks for her mother. She's calling out for a woman who was arrested for cooking meth in the backyard because she's a child. And no matter how dysfunctional your parent is, when you're scared and alone, you want your mom. And Kenny, as Mysterion, has been visiting Karen at night, watching over her, promising her she's safe. A child protecting a child, because no adult in their world is capable of doing it. This dynamic, the parentified sibling, the child caretaker, is one of the most common and most heartbreaking outcomes of parental neglect. When the adults can't or won't function as parents, the oldest functioning child steps into that role. And Kenny stepped into it so thoroughly that he built an entire identity around it. Mysterion isn't just a superhero fantasy, it's the psychological manifestation of Kenny's need to be the protector his parents can't be. And here's the tragic irony. Kenny protects Karen. He watches over her. He fights for her. But who protects Kenny? Nobody. There is no Mysterion for Kenny. There's no older sibling, no caring aunt, no neighbor who notices that this kid is going through things no child should go through. Kenny is his own last line of defense. And when he fails, when he dies, again and again, nobody even remembers. I said earlier that Kenny's immortality is a metaphor for the invisibility of suffering in neglectful households. And I want to add something to that now. It's also a metaphor for resilience, because Kenny keeps coming back. No matter how many times he dies, no matter how gruesome or painful or pointless the death is, he wakes up in his bed the next morning, and he goes to school, and he stands at the bus stop, and he lives his life. And that resilience, that refusal to stay down, that inability to be permanently destroyed, that's what children of neglect develop. Not because they're special or superhuman, because they have no other choice. The alternative to getting up is staying down, and staying down means giving up. And children, by nature, don't give up. They adapt, they survive, they find a way. Kenny McCormick finds a way every single time. Let me shift to something I've been thinking about throughout this whole analysis, and it's about the relationship between parenting and masculinity in South Park. Because the show has a lot to say about fatherhood specifically, about what it means to be a dad, about the models of masculinity these fathers embody, and about how those models shape their sons. Randy Marsh's version of masculinity is essentially adolescent. He wants to be the cool guy, the fun guy, the guy who can fight and drink and rock out and do whatever the latest thing is. His masculinity is performative. It's about being seen, about impressing people, about proving something. And this creates a specific problem for Stan, because Stan is growing up with a father whose idea of being a man is fundamentally about external validation. Randy needs applause. He needs an audience. He needs to be the center of attention. And when a boy grows up watching that, he learns that masculinity is a performance. Something you put on for other people, not something internal, quiet, solid. Gerald Broflovski's masculinity is professional and intellectual. He's a lawyer. He's educated. He earns well. His masculinity is defined by success, by status, by being the respectable man in the community. But underneath that surface, he's the skank hunt. He's the troll. He's the guy who needs to tear things down in secret because the public version of himself is so constrained and so controlled that the pressure has to vent somewhere. And Kyle inherits both versions, the public righteousness and the private complexity. Kyle is constantly trying to be the good guy, the righteous one, the one who does the right thing. And you can see how much effort it takes. How much of Kyle's morality is performance, in the same way Gerald's respectability is performance. Stephen Stoch's masculinity is authoritarian and fragile. He needs to be in control at all times. He needs his word to be law. He needs Butters to be obedient, compliant, unchallenging, and any threat to that control, Butters' innocence, Butters' questions, Butters' mere existence as a person with his own needs and desires, triggers an immediate punitive response. Stephen's masculinity is a fortress built on fear, and every time Butters bumps against its walls, Stephen shores them up with another grounding, another punishment, another assertion of dominance. And his bisexuality adds another layer here, because in Stephen's world, masculinity and heterosexuality are inseparable. To be a man is to be straight, to be in control, to be the patriarch. His desire for men doesn't fit that framework, so he hides it, represses it. And the energy of that repression, the constant effort of maintaining a masculine identity that contradicts a fundamental part of who he is, manifests as rigidity, as control, as the compulsive need to impose order on the one person in his life who can't fight back, his son. Stuart McCormick's masculinity is defeated. He's been broken by poverty, by alcoholism, by the slow realization that his life didn't turn out the way he hoped. His best friend became a lawyer, and he became nothing. And his response to that defeat isn't rage or rebellion. It's surrender. He drinks. He fights with his wife. He sits in his collapsing house with his ColecoVision and his frozen waffles, and he doesn't try anymore. And Kenny sees that. Kenny sees a father who has given up. And Kenny's response, his fierce, stubborn, never say die resilience, is a direct rejection of his father's example. Kenny refuses to be defeated. Kenny refuses to stay down because he's seen what staying down looks like. And it looks like Stuart McCormick, drunk on the couch at 3 p.m. And then there's the absence of a father in the Cartman household. Eric has no father. Not really. The mystery of his paternity was a running joke for 14 seasons before the show revealed in 201 that his father was Jack Tenorman, a Denver Broncos player who Cartman had already arranged to have killed. So Cartman's relationship with fatherhood is one of total absence, followed by unknowing destruction. He killed his own father without knowing it, and by the time he learns the truth, it's too late. The act is done. The father is gone, and there's no undoing it. And I think the absence of a father is central to understanding Cartman's psychology, not just because it left him without a male role model, although it did, but because it left him without any counterweight to Leanne's permissiveness. In many families where one parent is overly permissive, the other parent provides balance. Not always in a healthy way. Sometimes the other parent is too strict, and you get a different kind of dysfunction. But at least the child experiences the existence of limits, even inconsistent ones. Cartman never had that. He had Leanne, and only Leanne. And Leanne's love, unchecked by any other parental influence, became the only gravitational force in his universe. And nature abhors a vacuum. The space where a father should have been, where limits, structure, discipline, and a model of healthy masculinity should have existed, was empty. And Cartman filled it himself with authoritarianism, with demands for respect, with the assertion of dominance over everyone around him. He became, in a twisted way, his own father, his own authority, his own law, because no one else would be it for him. Think about Cartman's catchphrase one more time. Respect my authority. It's a child demanding the thing he's never had, not authority over others, authority in his life, a sense that someone is in charge, that there are rules, that the world has structure. He's screaming for what Leanne never gave him and what a father might have. And I know this is going to sound weird, but I actually think Cartman's obsession with Kyle has a parental dimension to it. Kyle pushes back on Cartman harder than anyone. Kyle says no. Kyle holds a line. Kyle tells Cartman he's wrong and refuses to back down, no matter how much Cartman manipulates or threatens or schemes. And for a kid who's never experienced that from a parental figure, that opposition might actually feel like the closest thing to genuine care he's ever encountered from a peer, because at least Kyle takes him seriously. At least Kyle engages. Leanne just gives in. Kyle fights. And fighting requires attention. It requires that the other person sees you, really sees you. And Cartman, on some level, might need that more than anything. Okay, I know I've been going a long time, but there are a few more threads I want to pull before we wrap this up, because I think they're essential to a complete picture. One of them is about how South Park handles the concept of therapy and professional intervention in families, because the show's take on this is fascinating and, I think, often misunderstood. South Park is generally skeptical of therapists and counselors. Mr. Mackey, the school counselor, is well-meaning but ineffective. His advice usually boils down to "mk" and vague platitudes. When parents seek professional help, as Leanne does in Test, the professionals either fail spectacularly, the TV nannies, or succeed temporarily before the family system reasserts itself. Cesar Millan. The show seems to be saying that professional intervention can't fix family dynamics because family dynamics are self-reinforcing systems. You can change one element, Cartman's behavior, Randy's drinking, but unless the underlying system changes, the element snaps back. And you know what? From a systems theory perspective in psychology, the show is largely right. Family therapy has long recognized that treating individuals without addressing family systems produces temporary results. You can teach a kid better behavior, but if you send them back into the same family environment, the environment will reshape the behavior. You can help a parent recognize their pattern, but if the marriage, the community, the financial situation, the unresolved trauma, if all of those things remain unchanged, the patterns reassert themselves. That's exactly what happens in Tst. Cesar Millan fixes Cartman's behavior, but he doesn't fix Leanne's loneliness. He doesn't give her a social network, a romantic partner, a sense of purpose beyond her son. So when he leaves, the system, Leanne's need for companionship, Cartman's role as her companion, reasserts itself, and the behavior comes back. And in a way, that's the show's most mature insight about parenting. The problem is never the child. The problem is always the system. And the system is bigger than any one person's willingness to change. But there's one episode that cuts against this pattern, and I think it's really important. Raisins. The one I mentioned earlier, where Butters gives his speech about preferring to feel sad rather than feel nothing. Because in that moment, Butters breaks free from the system. Not by fixing his parents, not by getting professional help, not by changing the family dynamic, just by choosing, in a single moment of clarity, to feel what he feels instead of performing what's expected of him. It's a tiny act of rebellion, the quietest revolution you've ever seen. A kid saying, "I'd rather be sad," to a world that wants him to be happy, or angry, or numb, or anything other than authentically himself. And the show suggests, gently, quietly, in the way that good art does, that this might be the only way out. Not through systems, or therapy, or intervention. Through the simple, radical act of being honest about what you feel. That's a message for the kids watching, I think. For the people listening to this right now, who grew up in a household that didn't work, who had parents who loved them wrong, who are still carrying patterns and fears and defense mechanisms that were forged in childhood homes they've long since left. The message is, you can't go back and fix your parent. You can't rewrite your childhood, but you can choose right now, in this moment, to feel what you feel, to stop performing, to stop managing, to stop parenting your parent, to just be. And maybe that's enough, or maybe it isn't. That's for you to decide. Let me talk about one more thing before I start wrapping up, and it's about Tegrity Farms. Because the Tegrity Farms era, which started in season 22 and ran for several seasons, represents the most extreme version of Randy's parenting failures. And it also represents the show's most sustained exploration of what happens when a parent's obsession literally uproots the entire family. Randy decides to start a marijuana farm. He doesn't consult his family. He moves them, Sharon, Stan, Shelley, from their home in South Park to a rural farm. He rebrands himself as a farmer. He becomes obsessed with the business, and the family is miserable. Sharon hates it, Stan hates it, Shelley hates it, but Randy doesn't care. Or rather, he cares, but his need to pursue this new identity outweighs his awareness of their suffering. And this is such a precise illustration of what happens in families where one parent is in the grip of a narcissistic project. Whether it's a business venture, a creative pursuit, a religious conversion, a political cause, when a parent becomes consumed by something that defines their identity, the family becomes an appendage to that project. Their needs are subordinated. Their happiness is conditional on supporting the parent's vision. And any resistance, any expression of discontent or desire for something different, is treated as disloyalty. Sharon expresses her unhappiness repeatedly during the Tegrity Farms era, and Randy either ignores her or dismisses her, because to acknowledge her unhappiness would be to question his project, and his project is his identity. And questioning his identity is the one thing Randy Marsh can never do, because without the project, without the obsession of the week, Randy would have to sit with himself, and he'd have to feel the unhappiness that he's been running from since You're Getting Old. And Stan basically checks out. He becomes background in his own family. He goes along with things because he's learned over 15 plus years of Randy's behavior that resistance is futile, that his father will do what his father will do regardless of what anyone else wants. And the healthiest thing Stan can do is just endure, wait it out, hope the next obsession is less disruptive than the current one. That learned helplessness, that resigned acceptance of a parent's dominance over the family's direction is something that stays with people long after childhood. It shows up in relationships where you defer to your partner's decisions because you learned early that your preferences don't matter. It shows up in workplaces where you don't speak up because you learned that speaking up doesn't change anything. It shows up in the quiet internal voice that says, why bother? They're going to do what they want anyway. And I think that's the saddest thing about Stan Marsh. Not that he has a crazy father. Not that his parents' marriage is troubled. Not that he develops cynicism and turns to alcohol. The saddest thing is the resignation. The quiet acceptance of chaos as the normal condition of existence. The way he stopped being surprised by Randy's behavior. The way he just stands there, waiting for it to pass. I think about this when I think about the kids I grew up with who had that look, that tired, old before their time look. The kids who had learned by age 10 or 11 that home was something you survived, not something you enjoyed, and they were fine, mostly. They went to school and hung out with their friends and did normal kid stuff, but there was always something behind their eyes, a weariness, a knowledge, and I see that in Stan Marsh. And the fact that a construction paper character on a show about fart jokes can make me see that, can make me feel that, tells you everything about how good this show actually is. You know what? There's one more episode I need to talk about, because it brings together almost everything we've discussed tonight, and it's Dead Kids, Season 22, Episode 1, aired September 26, 2018. In Dead Kids, there are school shootings happening at South Park Elementary regularly, and the core of the episode isn't the shootings themselves, it's Randy's reaction versus Sharon's reaction. Randy treats the shootings as normal, as just part of life, nothing to get worked up about. Sharon, on the other hand, is devastated. She's crying, she's panicking, she's trying to get the other parents to take action. And the joke, the dark, savage, perfect joke, is that the other parents treat Sharon like she's the one with the problem, like her emotional reaction to children dying in school is an overreaction. Like she's being dramatic, like she needs to calm down. And this episode is about a lot of things: gun violence, normalization of tragedy, American desensitization to mass shootings. But on a family level, it's about the fundamental disconnect between how Randy and Sharon experience reality. Sharon feels things. Randy doesn't, or won't. And in the Marsh family, as in so many real families, the person who feels things is treated as the problem, not the situation, the reaction. This is something therapists see constantly. In families with an emotionally avoidant partner, a Randy, and an emotionally engaged partner, a Sharon, the engaged partner is often pathologized. Why are you so upset? Why do you always overreact? Why can't you just relax? These questions aren't genuine inquiries. They're deflections. They're ways of making the other person's emotional response the issue, so you don't have to deal with the actual thing they're responding to. And Stan watches this. He watches his father dismiss his mother's pain. He watches his mother be isolated in her grief. He watches the adults around him normalize something horrifying. And what does he learn? He learns that feelings are dangerous, that caring too much makes you the outsider, that the safest thing to do is what Randy does, not what Sharon does. And isn't that exactly the lesson that produces the kind of emotionally shut down, cynical, resigned person that Stan became in You're Getting Old? Isn't that the direct through line? A kid who watched his father avoid feelings his entire childhood eventually becomes a teenager who can't feel anything without it looking like crap. Remember what I said earlier about how parenting isn't something you do, it's something you are? Randy isn't teaching Stan to be emotionally avoidant. He's not giving lectures about it. He's not even aware he's doing it. He's just being Randy. And Stan absorbs it, the way children absorb everything, silently, completely, without even knowing it's happening. And that is maybe the most frightening thing about parenting. Not the big moments, not the drunk driving or the murder attempts or the meth labs, the small moments, the daily, invisible, unremarkable moments where you're just being yourself in front of your child, and your child is watching and learning and becoming. And you know, while we're talking about moments that reveal character, I want to go back to the Broflovskis for a second, because there's an episode I haven't mentioned yet that I think is one of the most underrated examinations of parenting in the entire series, and it's The Entity, Season 5, Episode 11, November 21st, 2001. This is the episode where Kyle's cousin, Kyle Schwartz, also named Kyle, comes to visit from Connecticut. And Kyle Schwartz is, well, he's every Jewish stereotype cranked up to 11. He's nerdy, he's allergic to everything, he whines constantly, he's bad at sports. And Kyle Broflovski is mortified by him, deeply, genuinely embarrassed. And what's interesting about this from a parenting perspective is that Sheila is thrilled. She loves having Kyle Schwartz around. She dotes on him. She thinks he's wonderful. And Kyle Broflovski, her actual son, the kid she's raised, looks at this and feels, what? Inadequacy, jealousy, confusion? Because here's his mother, embracing this version of Jewishness that Kyle Broflovski has spent his entire life trying to transcend. The stereotypical version. The version that Cartman mocks him for. And his mother thinks it's great. And this reveals something important about Sheila's relationship with Jewish identity and how it affects her parenting. Sheila is proud of being Jewish. Loudly, assertively proud. And she wants Kyle to be proud too. But Kyle's experience of being Jewish in South Park is fundamentally different from Sheila's. For Kyle, being Jewish means being the target of Cartman's anti-Semitism, being the only Jewish kid in a mostly Christian town, being different in a way that brings him constant grief. And Sheila, from her position of adult confidence and community standing, can't fully see that. She can't understand that the identity she wears as a badge of honor is, for her son, often a source of pain. And this disconnect between a parent's positive relationship with their identity and a child's more complicated one is something that happens in families all the time. Parents from marginalized communities who are proud of their heritage, but whose children experience that heritage primarily through the lens of discrimination. Parents who love their religion, but whose children feel burdened by it. Parents who are comfortable in a small town, but whose children feel trapped. The parent sees the beauty, the child sees the cost, and neither is wrong. But the gap between their perspectives can create a loneliness that neither of them fully understand. Kyle carries that loneliness. He carries it in every argument with Cartman about being Jewish. He carries it in every moment where his identity makes him a target. And Sheila, for all her fierce protectiveness, can't protect him from that. Because the thing that hurts him isn't something external that she can fight against. It's the tension between who she wants him to be and the world he actually lives in. I actually think this is one of the show's most subtle and important psychological observations. It's not about bad parenting. It's about the limits of parenting. There are things a parent simply cannot do for their child. They can't make the world safe. They can't make identity painless. They can't shield their kid from the specific cruelties that come with being who they are. And the parents who try, the Sheilas of the world, who mobilize and protest and go to war, sometimes make it worse. Because the child doesn't just have to deal with the original problem. They have to deal with their parents' reaction to the problem. And sometimes the reaction is louder and scarier and more embarrassing than the problem itself. Kyle doesn't need Sheila to start Mothers Against Anti-Semitism. He needs her to sit with him and listen when he tells her that being the only Jewish kid in South Park is hard. He needs her to say, "I hear you," instead of "I'll fix this." He needs her to understand that her response to his pain shouldn't be bigger than his pain, and that the difference between fixing and listening, between acting and witnessing, between crusading and being present, that's one of the hardest lessons in parenting. And Sheila never quite learns it, and Kyle pays the price. Let me take a tangent here that I think is relevant. I've been putting this video together over the course of several weeks, and during that time, I've been rewatching episodes I haven't seen in years. And one thing that struck me, coming back to it with this parenting lens, is how much the show's portrayal of community meetings functions as a portrait of collective parenting failure. You know those scenes. The parents of South Park are gathered in the community center or the school gymnasium. They're panicking about something. Someone stands at a podium. Arguments break out. Nobody has a plan. And eventually, the meeting devolves into chaos, accomplishes nothing, and the kids are left to solve the problem on their own. These scenes are played for comedy, and they're consistently funny, but they're also a perfect illustration of what happens when an entire community of anxious, dysfunctional, poorly self-regulated adults tries to act collectively. They amplify each other's worst tendencies. Sheila's moral outrage feeds Sharon's anxiety feeds Randy's impulse to act. Without thinking feeds Gerald's desire to appear in control, feeds Stephen's need for order. And the result is a feedback loop of adult dysfunction that produces exactly the opposite of what any of them individually intended. And the kids watch, from the back of the room, or from outside, or from wherever they've been relegated to, while the adults panic. They watch their parents be ridiculous, and they learn, once again, that adults are unreliable, that the people in charge aren't actually in charge, that the world is run by people who are making it up as they go along, terrified and confused, and incapable of admitting it. And here's the thing, that's true, not just in South Park. In real life, adults are making it up as they go along. Parents are winging it. Nobody actually knows what they're doing. And the difference between a good parent and a bad parent isn't that the good parent has it figured out. It's that the good parent is willing to admit they don't. Good parents say, I don't know. Good parents say, I was wrong. Good parents say, let me think about that. Bad parents, in the South Park universe and in real life, have to be right, have to be in control, have to have the answer. And that rigid certainty, that inability to sit with uncertainty, is what produces the dysfunction we've been talking about all night. Randy can't admit he's unhappy, so he channels his misery into one insane project after another. Sheila can't admit she might be overreacting, so she escalates every moral concern into a crusade. Stephen can't admit his parenting is abusive, so he doubles down on it. Gerald can't admit he has a shadow side, so he hides it behind a screen name. Leanne can't admit she's lonely, so she spoils her son to keep him close. Stuart can't admit he's the source of his own problems, so he blames Gerald and drinks. None of them can say, I don't know what I'm doing, I'm scared, I need help. And if any of them could say that, truly say it and mean it and act on it, their families would change overnight. Not because saying it is magic, but because the willingness to admit uncertainty is the prerequisite for growth. You can't learn if you already know everything. You can't change if you can't admit that change is needed. And you can't be a good parent if you can't acknowledge that you're not one yet. I think that's what separates the South Park parents from each other, ultimately. Not their specific dysfunctions, not permissiveness versus authoritarianism versus neglect, but their relationship with self-awareness. The parents who have moments of self-awareness, even brief, quickly suppressed moments, are the ones whose children have the best chance. Randy has moments. In You're Getting Old, he admits he's unhappy. In Bloody Mary, he listens to Stan. In numerous episodes, he shows a capacity for self-reflection that he then immediately undermines. But the capacity is there. Leanne has moments. In Tist, she experiences what it would be like to have a well-behaved child. She sees the possibility. She just can't sustain it because her needs overwhelm her awareness. Even Stephen has moments. In About Last Night, Season 12, Episode 12, November 5th, 2008. When he thinks the world is ending after Obama's election, he tells Butters he loves him. Granted, he thought they were about to die, but the love was real. The willingness to say it, even under extreme duress, suggests that somewhere inside Stephen, beneath the rigidity and the control and the compulsive grounding, there's a father who knows his son deserves better than what he's getting. The McCormicks have the fewest moments of self-awareness, and their children pay the highest price for it. Stuart and Carol are too deep in their addiction and their poverty to step outside themselves long enough to see what they're doing to their kids. And the result is Kenny dying over and over, invisible and unremembered. And Karen, small and scared, clinging to a brother who's barely older than she is. And Kevin, fading into the background, becoming nobody. And maybe that's the final, definitive statement the show makes about parenting. That the most dangerous thing isn't anger or permissiveness or strictness or neglect. It's blindness, the inability or unwillingness to see what you're doing to your child, to really see it, not through the lens of your own needs or your own trauma or your own ideology, but through the child's eyes, from down there, from the bus stop, from the back seat, from the bedroom with the door closed, listening to your parents fight through the walls. If there's one thing every parent in South Park has in common, it's that they can't see their children clearly. They see versions of their children. The obedient son, the companion, the problem child, the burden, the project. But they don't see the actual kid. The one who's standing right there, in his orange parka, or his blue hat, or his red coat, waiting to be seen. And maybe the most radical thing a parent can do, more radical than any crusade or any punishment or any expensive gift, is to look at their child and see them. Not who you want them to be, not who you're afraid they might become, just who they are, right now, in this moment. Butters, standing in his room, scolding himself because his parents have taught him he's the problem. Stan, sitting at the dinner table, watching his dad embarrass the family again. Kyle, carrying the moral weight of a world his parents told him was his to fix. Kenny, in his orange parka, standing at the bus stop, quietly enduring. Eric, on the couch, with a Mega Ranger and a smile that means nothing good. These are the children of South Park. These are the products of love. Imperfect, misguided, desperate, selfish, well-meaning, terrified, boundless love. And they are so recognizable because they're us. All of us. Every person who grew up in a family that wasn't quite right, which is every person who ever grew up at all. And you know, that brings me to something I've been wanting to talk about throughout this whole video. The topic of how South Park handles the concept of the good parent, or rather, how it refuses to present one. Because here's the thing, in most TV shows, animated or otherwise, there's at least one family that functions as the benchmark. The Huxtables, the Taylors from Friday Night Lights. Even in shows about dysfunction, there's usually a family that exists to show you what right looks like. And South Park doesn't do that. There is no healthy family in South Park. There is no household you'd want to grow up in. And I think that's a deliberate choice. And I think it's the right one. Because in real life, there is no perfect family. There is no household where the parents always get it right. There's just a spectrum of dysfunction. And the question isn't, are these parents good or bad? The question is, how severe is the dysfunction, and how does the child adapt to it? The Broflovskis are probably the closest thing the show has to functional parents, and they still produce a child who's chronically anxious and morally burdened. The Marshes have moments of warmth and connection, and they still produce a child who turns cynical and starts drinking at 10. The Cartmans have genuine love between mother and son, and they still produce one of the most dangerous personalities in television history. The Stoches have a stable household and financial security, and they still produce a child who wakes up to the sound of his own screams. The McCormicks have real love beneath the dysfunction, and they still produce a child who dies repeatedly without anyone remembering. And the show says, yeah, that's how it works. Love is not enough. Stability is not enough. Money is not enough. Good intentions are not enough. Parenting is the most important job in the world, and nobody is qualified for it. And everybody fails at it to some degree. And the question is not whether you'll damage your children, but how and how much. That's not a comforting message. It's not an optimistic message, but I think it's an honest one. And I think honesty, even uncomfortable honesty, is more useful than false reassurance. Because if you grow up thinking there's a right way to be a family, and your family didn't do it that way, you spend your whole life thinking something was wrong with you. But if you understand that every family is messy, that every parent fails, that every child is shaped by imperfections they didn't choose and can't control, then maybe you can stop blaming yourself. Maybe you can stop blaming your parents. Maybe you can just accept it and start building something better. Not perfect, better. And I think South Park, for all its crudeness and shock value and deliberate provocations, is ultimately saying exactly that. Accept the mess. Laugh at it if you can. Feel it if you need to. And build something better. Not because your parents showed you how, but because, like Butters, you'd rather feel the pain than feel nothing at all. Let me talk about one more psychological concept that I think ties everything together, and then I'll start bringing this home. The concept is called good enough parenting. It was coined by a British pediatrician and psychoanalyst named Donald Winnicott in the 1950s. And the idea is simple but profound. Children don't need perfect parents. They need good enough parents. Parents who are present most of the time. Parents who are responsive most of the time. Parents who make mistakes but repair them. Parents who are imperfect but consistent enough that the child develops a basic sense of trust in the world. And the key word is enough. Not perfect, not ideal, not optimized. Enough. Good enough means the parent fails sometimes, and the child learns that failure isn't the end of the world. Good enough means the parent is sometimes distracted, sometimes frustrated, sometimes wrong, and the child learns that humans are complicated and that love can coexist with imperfection. Now, by Winnicott's standard, how do the South Park parents measure up? And this is where it gets really interesting. Randy Marsh is borderline good enough. In the moments between his obsessions, he's a present, loving father. He shows up to Stan's events. He has conversations with his son. He listens. Sometimes. He's not good enough consistently because his narcissistic cycles regularly pull him away from the family. But in his better moments, he's there. And Stan, shaped partly by those better moments, develops into a fundamentally decent person. So maybe, just barely, Randy crosses the threshold. On average, Sharon Marsh is good enough. She's consistently present. She's emotionally available, even when she's frustrated. She maintains the household. She's the one who actually shows up, day after day, without the drama and the fireworks. And her goodness is so quiet and so unremarkable that the show barely acknowledges it, which is itself a commentary on how motherhood works. The person who keeps everything running gets no credit because their competence is invisible. Sheila Broflovski is good enough in some dimensions and not in others. Her warmth is real. Her engagement is real. But her controlling nature and her moral intensity push past the enough threshold into territory that restricts Kyle's development rather than supporting it. She's an overcorrection parent. She's so determined not to fail that her vigilance becomes its own form of failure. Gerald Broflovski is good enough on the surface and not good enough underneath. His public parenting is solid. His private life is a mess. And eventually, the gap between those two things becomes unsustainable. Season 20 proves that. Leanne Cartman is not good enough. And I say that with genuine compassion for her, because I think she wants to be. She wants to be a good mother so badly, but wanting isn't doing. And the absence of boundaries, the permissiveness, the use of her son as an emotional substitute for adult companionship, those things put her below the threshold. Not because she doesn't love Eric, because her love doesn't include the component that children need most, the willingness to be disliked in the service of the child's long-term well-being. Stephen and Linda Stoch are not good enough. Their authoritarianism, their rigidity, their inability to see Butters as a person rather than a problem to be managed. All of it falls below the threshold. Butters survives them. He even thrives in his own sweet, traumatized way. But he survives despite them, not because of them. Stuart and Carol McCormick are not good enough. Their addictions, their poverty, their domestic violence, these things create an environment where a child's basic needs, physical and emotional, are consistently unmet. And the result is a family where the children have had to become their own parents, their own protectors, their own sources of stability. And here's the thing. I said at the top that every parent in South Park loves their children, and I stand by that. But good enough parenting isn't about love. It's about capacity. It's about having the internal resources, emotional, psychological, sometimes financial, to translate love into the specific behaviors that a child needs. And what South Park shows, with painful clarity, is that love without capacity is just a feeling. A warm, well-intentioned feeling that doesn't feed anyone, doesn't protect anyone, doesn't guide anyone. Stuart McCormick loves his children, but love doesn't fill the refrigerator. Love doesn't stop the drinking. Love doesn't fix the house. Love doesn't create the stability that a child needs to develop trust in the world. Leanne Cartman loves her son, but love doesn't set boundaries. Love doesn't say no. Love doesn't create the friction that a child needs to develop self-control and empathy. Stephen Stoch loves Butter, but love doesn't undo the damage of authoritarian control. Love doesn't repair the self-image of a child who's been taught he's a problem. Love doesn't break the cycle of abuse that Stephen inherited from his own mother. Love is necessary, but not sufficient. That's what the show is saying. In every family, in every episode, in every scene where a parent is doing the wrong thing for the right reasons, or the right thing in the wrong way. Love is the foundation, but you can't live in a foundation. You need walls, and a roof, and plumbing, and heat. You need the unglamorous, practical, daily acts of competent caregiving that turn love from a feeling into a home. And most of the parents in South Park can't do that. Not because they're bad people, because they're broken people. Broken by their own parents, their own addictions, their own fears, their own unexamined lives. And their brokenness becomes their children's brokenness, which will become their grandchildren's brokenness. On and on, generation after generation, until someone, maybe Butters, maybe Stan, maybe even Kyle, breaks the chain, or doesn't. That's the other possibility. That the chain doesn't break, that the patterns continue, that the dysfunction repeats. And South Park, with characteristic honesty, acknowledges both possibilities without telling you which one to bet on, because the show respects you enough to let you decide. I know I keep saying one more thing and then saying another thing after that, but I promise, this is actually the last thread I want to pull before I wrap up. And it's about the post-COVID specials, because those specials, South Park post-COVID and South Park post-COVID, the return of COVID, give us something the series proper never has. A look at what these children became as adults. And what they became is revealing. Stan became an alcoholic, living alone, working a dead-end job. Essentially, he became Randy. Kyle became a lonely, isolated, idealistic person still trying to fix the world, still carrying the weight, still crusading. Essentially, he became a gentler version of Sheila. Cartman became, well, first the show suggests he became a rabbi with a family, which is either genuine growth or an elaborate manipulation. And the ambiguity is the point. Because with Leanne as his only parent, the question of whether Cartman is capable of genuine change is genuinely unanswerable. The permissive, boundary-free household he grew up in left his capacity for authentic connection permanently in doubt. Kenny became a millionaire scientist. The kid from the poorest family in town channeled his resilience and his intelligence into success, and then died. Again, permanently, this time, pursuing a solution to COVID that would save everyone else. Kenny in death as in life, selfless, invisible, unremembered. And Butters became Victor Chaos, institutionalized, broken. The accumulated damage of a lifetime of authoritarian abuse and parental neglect, finally overwhelming the optimism and kindness that had been his shield. And every single one of those adult outcomes can be traced directly back to their childhood households. Stan becomes his father. Kyle becomes his mother. Cartman remains undefined because he was never given definition. Kenny sacrifices himself because that's what he's always done. And Butters breaks because he was always breaking. It just took 40 years to complete. That's not determinism. The show isn't saying these outcomes were inevitable. It's saying they were probable, that the patterns established in childhood have a gravitational pull that's incredibly difficult to escape, and that most people, not all, but most, end up orbiting the same stars their parents orbited. Drinking, crusading, controlling, neglecting, enabling. The specific behaviors change, but the underlying dynamics repeat, unless someone breaks the cycle. And in the post-COVID specials, someone does. The kids go back in time. They change things. They create a different future. A future where Butters isn't institutionalized, where Stan isn't alone, where Kenny doesn't have to die. And the mechanism of that change, the thing that makes a different future possible, is the boys' friendship, their connection to each other, the bonds they formed despite their families, not because of them. And maybe that's the most important thing South Park has ever said about surviving a dysfunctional childhood, that the antidote to bad parenting isn't good parenting, because you can't go back and unhave the parents you had. The antidote is connection, friendship, the people who see you clearly, who know your damage and love you anyway, who remind you that you're more than what your family made you. Stan has Kyle. Kyle has Stan. Kenny has his friend. Even Butters has the boys, in their imperfect, often exploitative, occasionally deeply caring way. And those friendships, messy and complicated, and sometimes cruel as they are the lifeline. The thing that pulls the kids back from the edge that their parents pushed them toward. 4 boys, standing at a bus stop, in the snow, in a tiny Colorado mountain town, waiting for a bus that never seems to come on time. That's the image the show keeps returning to. 4 kids, side by side, facing the world together. And that togetherness, that simple, stubborn, imperfect togetherness is what saves them. Not their parents, not their teachers, not any institution or authority figure, just each other. And if you're lying in bed right now, listening to this, thinking about your own family, your own parents, your own childhood, I hope that image is something you can hold on to. Because wherever you came from, whatever patterns you inherited, whatever damage you carry, you're not alone. You were never alone. There were always other kids at the bus stop, and they were just as confused and scared and screwed up as you were. And together, standing in the snow, you figured it out. Imperfectly, messily, but you figured it out. That's what South Park is about. Under everything else. Under the fart jokes, and the celebrity parodies, and the political satire, and the construction paper, and the shock. It's about 4 kids figuring it out together, and that's enough. Talked about. It's been a thread in the show since the red badge of gayness and clubhouses in season 2, and it comes to a head in Bloody Mary. But what I find interesting is that Randy's alcoholism isn't treated the way most TV shows treat addiction. It's not a special episode. It's not a dramatic intervention. It's just part of who he is. It waxes and wanes. Sometimes he's drinking at Little League games. Sometimes he's fine. Sometimes he's falling down drunk. Sometimes he's sober for weeks. And that inconsistency, that unpredictability, is actually far more psychologically accurate than the typical TV portrayal of addiction, where it's either a crisis or it's resolved. Because that's how addiction works in real family. It's not constant. It's not always the worst case scenario. There are good days and bad days. There are stretches where everything seems fine, and then stretches where it absolutely isn't. And the child of an addict doesn't get to relax during the good stretches, because they've learned that the bad ones can come at any moment. They're always watching, always monitoring, always trying to read the room. And Stan does this. You can see it in the way he reacts to Randy's behavior. There's this resigned awareness, this kid who can tell within seconds whether his dad is about to do something stupid. And that hypervigilance, that constant scanning of a parent's mood and behavior, is one of the defining experiences of growing up with an addicted parent. You develop this sixth sense, this ability to read the emotional temperature of a room before you've even fully walked into it, and it stays with you. It becomes part of how you navigate every relationship for the rest of your life. Stuart McCormick's alcoholism is different. It's more severe, more constant, more destructive. Stuart isn't a binge drinker like Randy. He's a chronic drunk, and his alcoholism is intertwined with poverty in a way that creates a feedback loop. He drinks because he's poor because he drinks, and neither problem can be solved without addressing the other. The show illustrates this beautifully in Chickenpox, when Stuart and Gerald go on that fishing trip. Stuart resents Gerald's success. Gerald is oblivious to his own privilege. And the alcohol is the lubricant that keeps Stuart's resentment from turning into action. It numbs the pain of being the guy who built a clubhouse with his best friend and somehow ended up living in it while his friend became a lawyer. And here's something I find really telling. Gerald, the successful one, the lawyer, the one who escaped poverty, also has addiction. They're just more socially acceptable ones. Gerald's gambling problem, Gerald's cheesing, Gerald's trolling. These are all compulsive behaviors that serve the same psychological function as Stuart's drinking. They provide an escape from the reality of who Gerald actually is versus who he presents himself as being. The difference is that Gerald's addictions are private and contained, while Stuart's are public and destructive. And that difference has everything to do with class, with access to resources, with the ability to hide your dysfunction behind a comfortable house and a professional career. The show is saying something really important here, and I don't think it gets enough credit for it. It's saying that addiction and dysfunction aren't about character, they're about circumstance. Gerald and Stuart started in the same place, building a clubhouse together as kids. They had the same friendship, probably the same basic level of intelligence and ambition. But one of them got opportunities, and the other didn't. And the one who didn't turned to the bottle, and the one who did turn to trolling women on the internet while drinking red wine and listening to Boston. Same impulse, same emptiness, different packaging. And their children are shaped by which version of that emptiness they grew up around. Kyle grows up with a father whose dysfunction is hidden, which teaches him that appearances can be maintained even when reality is crumbling. Kenny grows up with a father whose dysfunction is visible, which teaches him that the world is harsh and unpredictable, and that you survive by being tough and not expecting too much. Now, I want to talk about something that I've been building toward this whole video, and it's the question that I think is at the heart of everything South Park says about parenting. And the question is this: can any of these kids escape? Can Stan escape Randy's narcissism and Sharon's enabling? Can Kyle escape Sheila's moral crusading and Gerald's hypocrisy? Can Cartman escape Leanne's permissiveness? Can Butters escape Steven's authoritarianism? Can Kenny escape Stuart and Carol's neglect? And the answer the show gives is complicated, because the show operates on a floating timeline. The kids never really age. They've been in 4th grade for almost 30 years, and that means the parenting patterns never really resolve. The cycles don't break. The damage accumulates without ever reaching a conclusion. But there are moments, brief, flickering moments, where you can see the possibility of escape. And those moments are some of the most powerful things the show has ever produced. There's a moment in Raisins, Season 7, Episode 14, December 10th, 2003, that I think about a lot. Stan has just been dumped by Wendy. He's devastated. His friends take him to Raisins, this Hooters-style restaurant, to cheer him up. It doesn't work. But Butters, who's also been there, and who's also been hurt by a girl who used him for tips, gives this speech at the end. And what he says is basically this: yeah, it hurts. Yeah, he's sad, but he'd rather be sad than be one of those kids who feels nothing. He'd rather feel the pain than be numb. And that, coming from Butters, the most abused kid in town, the kid who has every reason in the world to shut down and go numb, is extraordinary. It's the show saying that despite everything, despite the authoritarian control and the emotional abuse, and the attempted murder, something in this kid is still alive, still feeling, still willing to risk hurt rather than close off. And Stan, hearing this, goes home and just puts on a sad song and lies in bed. He doesn't try to fix it. He doesn't run from it. He just feels it. And in the context of a family where his father deals with every uncomfortable feeling by diving into the next insane obsession, that moment of Stan simply allowing himself to be sad is revolutionary. It's a break in the pattern. It's Stan choosing to do the thing Randy never does: sit with the feeling instead of running from it. I mean, I've rewatched that ending probably a dozen times, and it still gets me, because the show could have gone for a joke, could have had Stan do something ridiculous or destructive. Instead, it just let a 10-year-old kid be sad, in his room, alone, and that was the ending, and it was perfect. And there's another moment I want to highlight, because I think it's one of the most underappreciated scenes in the entire series. It's in Kenny Died, Season 5, Episode 13, December 5th, 2001. Kenny is dying, for real this time. Not the comedic, reset button death. A genuine, prolonged, painful death. And the boys visit him in the hospital. And Stan can't do it. He can't face it. He keeps finding excuses not to go. And Kyle calls him out on it. And eventually Stan does go. And he sits with Kenny. And he can't say anything. And here's what gets me about that scene. Stan's inability to face Kenny's death isn't a character flaw. It's a learned behavior. It's what happens when you grow up in a household where uncomfortable feelings are avoided at all costs, where the response to any difficult emotion is to change the subject, start a new project, dive into a new obsession. Stan has never been taught how to sit with pain. He's never seen his father do it. And so when he's confronted with the most painful thing a child can experience, the death of a friend, he doesn't have the tools. And when he finally does sit with Kenny, when he finally shows up and just is there, it's not because someone taught him how. It's because of who he is, underneath the patterns his family has given him. It's Stan's own fundamental decency overriding the emotional avoidance he's inherited from Randy. And I think that's the show's ultimate message about parenting. Not that parents determine who their children become, but that parents create the environment, the soil, in which their children's fundamental natures either flourish or struggle. Stan is decent despite Randy, not because of him. Kyle is moral despite Gerald's hypocrisy, not because of it. Butters is kind, despite Steven's cruelty, not because of it. Kenny is brave despite Stuart's neglect, not because of it. And even Cartman, look, even Cartman has moments, rare moments, but moments. In Tst, when Cesar Millan's techniques work, the show gives us a glimpse of who Cartman could have been. A studious kid, a responsible kid, a kid who eats a healthy breakfast and does his homework and is genuinely pleasant. That version of Cartman existed. It was possible. It was right there. And Leanne's loneliness killed it. Not Cartman's nature, Leanne's need. I want to pause here and talk about something meta, something about the way Trey Parker and Matt Stone write these parents. Because I think there's a reason the parenting in South Park feels so authentic, and it goes beyond research or observation. In the documentary 6 Days to Air, which followed the production of the season 15 premiere Human Centipede, in 2011, you get a glimpse of how Parker works. He writes under insane pressure. He's sleep deprived. He's stressed. He's making decisions about episodes that will be seen by millions of people, and he's doing it in the last possible hours before air. And in that pressure cooker, there's no time for artifice. There's no time to calculate what's clever or what's strategic. You just write what's true, what you know, what you feel. And I think that's why the parenting in South Park feels so raw. It's not researched, it's lived. Parker and Stone are writing from their own childhoods, their own relationships with their fathers, their own experiences of watching their friends become parents. And when Parker writes Randy being oblivious to Stan's embarrassment, he's writing from the perspective of a kid who once had to drive his drunk dad to a bleeding Virgin Mary statue. When Stone writes Sheila being overprotective and explosive, he's writing with echoes of his own mother's intensity. These aren't characters they invented from whole cloth. They're people they know, people they love, people who frustrated them and embarrassed them and made them who they are. And I think that's ultimately what makes this show's take on parenting so enduring. It's not cynical. For all the shock humor and the envelope pushing and the deliberate provocations, South Park's view of family is fundamentally compassionate. It says, yes, your parents screwed you up. And yes, they probably couldn't help it. And yes, you'll probably screw up your own kids too, in different ways, but with the same underlying helplessness. And that's okay. Not in the sense that it doesn't matter, in the sense that it's human. It's the most human thing there is, trying your best and having it not be enough, loving someone and still hurting them, wanting to protect your child and instead teaching them that the world is something they need protection from. All right, I want to get into some more specific episodes and moments now, because there are a few I haven't touched on that I think are really important for this analysis. Let's talk about proper condom use. Season 5, Episode 7, August 1st, 2001. This is the episode where the parents of South Park have to deal with the question of sex education. And it starts because Stan is caught doing something inappropriate with the family dog. Not out of malice or perversion, but because he literally has no idea what it means. His friends told him it was funny. He didn't understand the sexual context. He's a child. And the parents' reaction is fascinating. Psychologically, they panic, they convene a meeting, and they immediately default to their characteristic patterns. They want to protect the children from information. They want to shield them from the reality of sex. And their solution is to have the school teach sex ed, but at wildly inappropriate ages, with wildly inappropriate content. Kindergartners are being taught about STDs, while the fourth graders still don't understand basic anatomy. And the result is that the children, lacking actual information and armed with misinformation and fear, divide into armed camps, boys versus girls, terrified of each other. And the episode ends with Chef, the one adult in town who's actually comfortable with sexuality, delivering the message: kids need age-appropriate, honest information. Not fear, not silence, not panic, just the truth. And what's brilliant about this episode in the context of parenting psychology is that it shows how parental anxiety becomes child anxiety. The parents are afraid of sex, not of sex itself, but of their children knowing about sex. Because if their children know about sex, they have to acknowledge that their children are growing up, that their children have bodies, that their children will eventually have sexual experiences. And that acknowledgement is terrifying because it means the parents are losing control of their children's inner worlds. And that fear, the fear of losing control of what your child knows, thinks, and feels, is at the root of so much dysfunctional parenting. Sheila's crusade against Terrence and Philip, Stephen's grounding of Butters, Gerald's lecture about gods and Claude, even Leanne's permissiveness, because if you never set a boundary, you never have to enforce one. And if you never enforce one, you never have to face the moment when your child pushes back and asserts their independence. Every parenting failure in South Park can be traced back to fear. Fear of losing the child. Fear of the child growing up. Fear of the child seeing who the parent really is. Fear of inadequacy. Fear of being alone. And isn't that just true? Like, forget the construction paper and the fart jokes and the celebrity parodies. Isn't that just true about being a parent? That the whole enterprise is built on the paradox that your job is to raise a person who doesn't need you anymore, and that success means being left behind. I think about that a lot. Honestly, I think about it every time I watch Leanne Cartman buy her son back with a Mega Ranger. Let me talk about one more family dynamic that I think deserves attention, and it's the relationship between Sheila Broflovski and Kyle's adopted brother Ike, because this adds a really interesting wrinkle to the Broflovski family psychology. Ike is adopted, he's Canadian, and Sheila and Gerald adopted him knowing that he's from another country, another culture, another background entirely. And Sheila, who founded Mothers Against Canada in the movie, a crusade against the very country Ike comes from, is also the mother who loves Ike deeply and fiercely. That contradiction, hating Canada while raising a Canadian child, is played for laughs, but it's also a really incisive commentary on the way moral crusades can create cognitive dissonance within family. Sheila's ideology says that Canada is bad, that Canadian influence is corrupting her children, but her lived reality includes a Canadian child whom she loves unconditionally. And the show never resolves this tension. It just lets it sit there. Because in real families, these contradictions don't get resolved either. Parents hold beliefs that are incompatible with their actual lives all the time. And the children absorb both the beliefs and the contradiction, and they're left to sort it all out on their own. And Kyle does sort it out. He's fiercely protective of Ike. In Miss Teacher Bangs a Boy, Season 10, Episode 10, October 18th, 2006, Kyle discovers that his little brother is being taken advantage of by an adult at his school. Someone in a position of authority is exploiting Ike, and Kyle's response is immediate and absolute. This is wrong, and I'm going to stop it. He doesn't care that other people in town are brushing it off or making jokes about it. Kyle recognizes that his brother is being victimized, even when the adults around him won't, and he fights to protect him. And where does that instinct come from? In part, it comes from Sheila, from the good parts of Sheila's parenting, the moral clarity, the willingness to fight for what's right, the fierce, protective love. Kyle inherited those qualities from his mother. He just doesn't apply them the way she does, with the blunt force of a crusade, with the assumption that louder means more right, with the conflation of outrage and action. Kyle's moral sense is more nuanced than Sheila's, because he's experienced the consequences of his mother's approach and has learned, painfully, where it breaks down. And that, a child who takes the best of what their parents gave them and refines it, evolves it, makes it their own, that's actually what healthy psychological development looks like, even in a dysfunctional family, even in a family where the parent is sometimes the villain. The child isn't doomed to repeat the parent's exact pattern. They can take the raw material, the values, the intensity, the willingness to care, and reshape it into something better. Kyle Broflovski is a better person than either of his parents, not because they failed him, although in some ways they did, but because he took what they gave him and made it more honest. That's growth. That's the possibility of change across generations. And it's one of the most quietly optimistic things South Park has ever said about the human condition. Alright, I want to bring this back around to something I said near the beginning. I said that every parent in South Park loves their children, and I want to sit with that now as we start to wind down, because I think it's the key to everything. Leanne loves Eric. She loves him so much that she can't bear to be his authority figure, because that would mean sometimes being the person he's angry at. And for a woman as lonely as Leanne, anger from the only person in her life feels like abandonment. Steven loves Butter. He loves him so much that he grounds him constantly, rigidly, desperately, because in Steven's damaged psychology, control is the only language love speaks. When your own childhood was defined by an authoritarian mother who punished you into compliance, you don't know that there's another way. You think discipline is love, because discipline is all you ever got. Randy loves Stan. He loves him and is proud of him and wants to share everything with him. Every stupid hobby, every new obsession, every embarrassing moment. The problem isn't the love. The problem is that Randy's love comes without boundaries. It overflows. It drowns the kid. Because Randy doesn't know where he ends and Stan begins, and he mistakes enmeshment for closeness. Sheila loves Kyle. She loves him with the fire of 1,000 suns and the volume of a bullhorn. She would go to war for him. She has gone to war for him. And the damage comes not from lack of love, but from love that expresses itself as control, as moral certainty, as the unshakable conviction that she knows what's best for her child in every situation. Gerald loves Kyle and Ike. He provides for them. He teaches them. He models, on the surface, what an engaged father looks like. And underneath, he's hiding an entire shadow self that undermines everything he teaches his sons about integrity. Stuart loves Kenny. Even through the haze of alcoholism and poverty and dysfunction, there are moments, real moments, where Stuart's love for his family is visible. When he and Carol decide to have another child. When Kenny, as Mysterion, manipulates his parents into being better, and they actually respond. The capacity for love is there. It's just buried under decades of addiction and despair. Carol loves her children. She holds Karen on her lap. She worries about Kenny. She fights with Stuart partly because she wants more for her family than what they have. And that's what makes South Park's portrayal of parenting so devastating. Not the dysfunction, the love. The fact that all of these parents love their children and still manage to hurt them. Because that's the cruelest truth about parenting. Love is not enough. Love without self-awareness is chaos. Love without boundaries is permissiveness. Love without honesty is performance. Love without the willingness to examine your own damage is just damage with a nicer label. I remember the first time that really hit me, rewatching the show for this video. It was during that ending. Leanne on the couch, Eric with the Mega Ranger, and I thought, she loves him. She really, genuinely loves him. And she just made a choice that will contribute to him becoming one of the most psychologically destructive human beings in their town's history. Not because she doesn't love him, because she does. Because her love is so wrapped up in her own loneliness and her own fear of abandonment that it can't function as the thing a child actually needs from a parent, which is not warmth, not generosity, not the absence of conflict, but the steady, boring, unglamorous presence of someone who will hold a line even when it's uncomfortable. Holding a line isn't dramatic. It isn't fun. It isn't the stuff of television episodes. But it's the thing that separates parenting from friendship. And Leanne can't do it. And Steven does too much of it. And Randy does it inconsistently. And Sheila does it about the wrong things. And Gerald does it while secretly undermining it. And Stuart and Carol are too deep in their own survival to even think about it. And the kids? The kids are left to figure out where the lines are on their own. And some of them, Stan, Kyle, Kenny, even Butters, figure it out pretty well, all things considered. They develop moral compasses and emotional resilience and the ability to love, despite having imperfect models. And Cartman doesn't, because Cartman never had a single line held for him, not once. And without that experience, without ever being told no by someone who loved him enough to mean it, he became something that none of the other kids became. Not evil exactly, uncontained, a force without friction, a personality without limits. And honestly, that might be the most important thing South Park has ever said about parenting. Not that bad parents make bad kids, but that the absence of boundaries, the absence of loving, consistent, boring, unglamorous boundaries creates a vacuum. And whatever rushes in to fill that vacuum is going to be shaped by the child's own impulses, untempered by the experience of being lovingly contained. And that's how you get a kid who can feed a bully's parents to him in chili and feel nothing, not because he's a monster, but because nobody ever taught him where the edges of acceptable behavior are. And you can't respect a line you've never encountered. If you're still listening at this point, and I know some of you are drifting off, and that's totally fine. That's what this is for. I want to leave you with one more thought, something to fall asleep to, if you want. I think the reason South Park's parenting resonates so deeply, the reason people keep making videos about it, keep writing essays about it, keep arguing about it in comment sections, is that it doesn't offer answers. The show never tells you how to be a good parent. It never presents a model of parenting that works perfectly. Even the most functional parents on the show, and I'd say that's the Broflovskis, with all their flaws, still produce a child who carries anxiety and moral burden beyond what any 10-year-old should have to carry. And I think that honesty is what makes the show meaningful, because there is no perfect parenting. There is no checklist you can follow that guarantees your kid turns out okay. There is only the messy, imperfect, day-to-day reality of trying to love someone while simultaneously being a flawed human being with your own unresolved trauma and your own bad habits and your own fears. And if you grew up with a Randy or a Sheila or a Leanne or a Steven, if you grew up watching your parent do the same ridiculous stuff every week, or control your every move, or give you everything you wanted except the one thing you needed, then you know what I'm talking about. You know what it's like to love someone and be frustrated by them, and be grateful for them, and wish they'd been different, all at the same time. And South Park captures that feeling better than almost anything else on television, because it doesn't simplify it. It doesn't resolve it. It just shows it in all its messy, human, construction paper glory. You know, I started this video talking about Leanne Cartman sitting on her couch, and I want to end there too, because I keep thinking about something Cesar Millan says in that episode. He says that the child thinks your world revolves around him, because it does. Because everything he does gets a response from you. And that's true of Cartman and Leanne. But it's also true, in different ways, of every parent and child on this show. Stan's world revolves around reacting to Randy. Kyle's world revolves around fighting against Sheila's crusades and reconciling his mother's values with his own experience. Butter's world revolves around avoiding Steven's punishment. Kenny's world revolves around surviving his parents' dysfunction. Every child in South Park is, on some fundamental level, organized around their parents' psychological patterns. They're satellites orbiting planets that don't even know they're exerting gravity. And maybe that's the deepest thing the show is saying, that parenting isn't something you do, it's something you are. Every unresolved issue, every suppressed fear, every unhealthy coping mechanism, every untreated addiction, all of it radiates outward. Your children feel it. They organize their lives around it. They develop personalities and defense mechanisms and worldviews in response to it. And they carry it forward into their own family, into their own relationships, into the next generation, unless someone breaks the cycle. And maybe that's the deepest thing the show is saying, that parenting isn't something you do, it's something you are. Every unresolved issue, every suppressed fear, every unhealthy coping mechanism, every untreated addiction, all of it radiates outward. Your children feel it. They organize their lives around it. They develop personalities and defense mechanisms and worldviews in response to it. And they carry it forward into their own family, into their own relationships, into the next generation, unless someone breaks the cycle. And maybe, just maybe, that's what Butters is for. That's why the show keeps coming back to him, because Butters is the character who, despite everything, might actually break the cycle, not through therapy or self-help or dramatic confrontation, just through the stubborn, irrational, inexplicable persistence of kindness in a world that has given him every reason to be cruel. And if that's not something worth thinking about as you fall asleep, I don't know what is. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. I mean that. These long-form videos take a lot out of me. A lot of rewatching, a lot of thinking, a lot of sitting with stuff that isn't always comfortable. And the fact that you're here, listening, maybe drifting off, maybe still wide awake, that means more than you know. If you enjoyed this, a subscribe really does help us keep making these for you. And if you can't sleep, well, that's what the next video is for. Take care of yourself. Good night.